April 6, 1917, and the United States took up arms to join the Allies. Recruits came, bankers, bakers, men from every walk of life. Goodbye, Broadway, and over there were the songs as they sailed. The Yanks are coming.
When people ask, why did the United States enter World War I? History tells us it was mostly a combination of three major events: the sinking of the Lusitania, the Zimmermann telegram, and Germany's decree to go back to unrestricted warfare. Most people cite the first two reasons, including J.P. Morgan Jr., as we can see from his testimony at the 1936 munitions industry hearings, where he stated, "Germany, as I say, drove us into the war by a series of acts, beginning with the sinking of the Lusitania and ending with the crowning insult of suggesting to Mexico to make war on us, promising it should have assistance, and the surrender of Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico as a reward." And while indeed those two events would be used to sway public sentiment and give it an appetite for war, we're going to take a deep look at some of what history doesn't tell us. And we'll start with the Lusitania. History in Hollywood has told us all about the Titanic. Repeatedly. For over 100 years, her story's been hammered into our collective conscious. But by comparison, most people really don't know much at all about the Lusitania, other than it being a reason to eventually lead the United States into World War I. And in my opinion, there's a reason for that. Let's have a quick look at some comparisons. The Lusitania was the largest ship in the world at the time of her launching, and the Titanic was the largest ship in the world at the time of her launching. And as you can see, both ships were launched within 5 years of each other. They both were carrying around 2,000 people when they sunk, with the Titanic carrying a few hundred more. Well over 1,000 people died in each tragedy. The Titanic didn't have enough lifeboats for the passengers when she went down, while the Lusitania did have enough lifeboats for her passengers. It took over 2.5 hours for the Titanic to sink, while it only took the Lusitania 18 minutes to fully submerge. The lack of time played a large part in the loss of life on the Lusitania. Had she been afforded the extra 2+ hours of sinking time, the loss of life would likely have been greatly reduced. Both ships had their damage on the starboard side, or the right side of the ships, the side shown at the bottom of the screen, and the known damage is in similar areas. I say similar because unlike the Titanic, the Lusitania is resting on her starboard side, which doesn't allow for divers to see the damage along that side. And of course the causes were the Titanic hit an iceberg, tearing a large hole along her side, and the Lusitania was torpedoed just behind the bridge, followed by a second large explosion anywhere from 15 to 30 seconds later, according to the accounts from the survivors, including its captain and crew members. This second explosion, while at first and for years was blamed on a second torpedo, has never been officially explained. And although historians disagree on what caused the second explosion, most agree that it was the reason for the ship to sink so quickly. And both ships went down, killing over 2,700 people combined, within 3 years of each other. In an overall sense, they're similar tragedies, but only one, the Titanic, has held the public's attention and memory for the last 100 years. If you're not familiar with the story of the Lusitania, she left New York's Pier 54 on May the 1st, 1915, for her routine journey across the Atlantic towards Liverpool, England. But 6 days later, on May 7th, 1915, about 11 miles south of the Irish coast, she was sunk by a torpedo from a German submarine. But if you'll notice, the very next day, on May 8th, in the headlines of the New York Times, it says the Lusitania was torpedoed twice, and a heavy propaganda campaign would begin. And this is why I say, in my opinion, there's a reason most people don't know very much about the Lusitania, especially compared to the Titanic. And that's because there's both a lot of inconvenient truths, as well as plenty of outright lies to be discovered when you dive in for a deep look into the Lusitania's story. Looking around the internet, we find this article on the Lusitania, published May 1st, 2014 from The Guardian, one of Britain's biggest news agencies. and let's have a look at their take on it. A 1980 salvage operation on the wreck of the Lusitania, the Cunard luxury liner that was torpedoed in the First World War, triggered a startling Foreign Office warning that its sinking could still, quote, literally blow up on us, end quote. Newly released secret Whitehall files disclosed that a Ministry of Defense warning that, quote, something startling, end quote, was going to be found during the August 1982 salvage operation raised such serious concerns that previously undeclared war munitions and explosives might be found that divers involved were officially warned in the strongest terms of the possible, quote, danger to life and limb, end quote, they faced. Foreign Office officials also voiced serious concerns that a final British admission that there were high explosives on the Lusitania could still trigger serious political repercussions with America, even though it was nearly 70 years after the event. The RMS Lusitania was sunk on the 7th of May 1915 by a torpedo fired without warning from a German submarine just off the Irish coast, with the loss of 1,198 lives, including 128 American civilians. The liner went down in just 18 minutes, and the loss of civilian life enraged U.S. public opinion and hastened America's entry into the First World War. The Cunard liner was nearing the end of her voyage from New York to Liverpool, and her sinking was to feature as a major theme in British propaganda and enlistment campaigns. Quote, take up the sword of justice, avenge the Lusitania, end quote, read one famous poster. The Foreign Office files released by the National Archives at Kew on Thursday show that news of the imminent salvage operation in 1982 sparked alarm across Whitehall. Quote, successive British governments have always maintained that there was no munitions on board the Lusitania, and that the Germans were therefore in the wrong to claim to the contrary as an excuse for sinking the ship, end quote, wrote Noel Marshall, the head of the Foreign Office's North America Department, on the 30th of July, 1982. Quote, the facts are that there is a large amount of ammunition in the wreck, some of which is highly dangerous. The Treasury have decided that they must inform the salvage company of this fact, in the interest of the safety of all concerned. Although there have been rumors in the press that the previous denial of the presence of munitions was untrue, this would be the first acknowledgement of the facts by His Majesty's government, end quote. Marshall said the disclosure of the true nature of the Lusitania's cargo was likely to spark a public, academic, and journalistic debate. He also reveals that Treasury solicitors have even gone so far as to consider whether the relatives of American victims of the sinking could still sue the British government if it was shown that the German claims were well-founded. A senior government lawyer, Jim Coombs at Treasury Chambers, told Marshall that the Admiralty has always denied that the Lusitania was armed or carrying war munitions, but that there had always been persistent rumors about the latter. He said, quote, it cannot be denied that the sinking of the Lusitania did much to sway American opinion in favor of entering the war. If it were now to come to light that there was after all some justification, however slight, for torpedoing, His Majesty Government's relations with America could well suffer. Your Republic of Ireland desk is of the opinion that the Irish would seek to create as much uproar as possible, end quote. But Coombs added that a 1918 New York court case had established the Lusitania had not been armed or carrying explosives but did have 4,200 cases of small arms ammunition aboard. He added that the cases of cartridges had been stowed well forward in the ship, 50 yards from where the German torpedo had struck. An urgent Whitehall search of the records was ordered. The Ministry of Defense said they could find no evidence to substantiate the rumors of a secret munitions store, but it was still felt to be prudent to warn the salvage company of the, quote, obvious but real danger inherent if explosives did happen to be present, end quote. For good measure, the Salvage Association was also told to deliver a similar warning, both orally and in writing. In 1918, a New York judge had ruled that there were 4,200 cases of safety cartridges, 18 fuse cases, and 125 shrapnel cases without any powder charge on board the liner when it went down, but that these did not constitute, quote, war munitions, end quote. He added that the Lusitania had not been armed or carried any high explosives. The 1915 British inquiry into the sinking of the Lusitania, chaired by Lord Mersey, barely touched on the issue. When a French survivor, Joseph Maréchal, a former army officer, tried to claim that the ship had sunk so quickly because the ammunition had triggered a second explosion, his testimony was quickly dismissed. Maréchal, who had been in the second-class dining room, said the explosion was, quote, similar to the rattling of a Maxim gun for a short period, end quote, and came from underneath the whole floor. Mersey dismissed him, quote, I do not believe him. His demeanor was very unsatisfactory. There was no confirmation of his story, end quote. The secret report of the inquiry concluded that the Lusitania was not carrying any explosives or any, quote, special ammunition, end quote. The British public were not told at the time about the 5,000 cases of small arms cartridges that had been aboard but were deemed non-military. Back in 1982 in Whitehall, it was agreed to stick to the official line that there had been no munitions aboard, and that it had, quote, always been public knowledge that the Lusitania's cargo included some 5,000 cases of small arms ammunition, end quote. Marshall, the senior Foreign Office Mandarin, however, remained skeptical. Quote, I am left with the uneasy feeling that this subject may yet, literally, blow up on us, end quote, he said, adding his suspicion that others in Whitehall had decided not to tell all that they knew. As for the salvage operation, it did recover 821 brass fuses for 6-inch shells, but failed to settle the bigger question. And that bigger question being, what was the cause of the second explosion? And we'll explore that in detail coming up, but going through the article in The Guardian, they do tell us some very interesting things, such as successive British governments have always maintained that there was no munitions on board the Lusitania. And in 1982, in Whitehall, it was agreed to stick to the official line that there would be no munitions aboard. And that, quote, official line, end quote, goes back to the original British inquiry, weeks after the sinking, in June of 1915. The Guardian also mentions the 1918 U.S. court case in New York that ruled the Lusitania had, quote, 4,200 cases of safety cartridges, 18 fuse cases, and 125 shrapnel cases, end quote, but that these did not constitute war munitions, nor was the Lusitania carrying any, quote, high explosives, end quote, and we'll certainly have a good look into those claims coming up. The Guardian also mentions about the 1982 salvage operation that it did recover 821 brass artillery fuses. So like I say, the Guardian does tell us some interesting information. And remember, this article was published in May of 2014. But it's what they don't tell us that I find even more interesting. So let's have a look at the, quote, 821 brass fuses for 6-inch shells, end quote. The Guardian didn't mention that the 1982 diving team that cut into the hull to retrieve them said there were thousands of them, and that they were live, nor did they mention the manufacturer.
Well, they were, in fact, artillery fuses, and we now know that when they were coming up from the bottom, they were, in fact, live. Now, the divers recovered almost 1,000 of them. They found case after case. We've also been able to trace precisely where they come from and what they are. Indeed, you can just read around the edge here that they were made by the armaments firm, the Bethlehem Steel Company in America in 1914.
So, how about that?
Artillery fuses, and we now know that when they were coming up from the bottom, they were in fact live.
So the artillery fuses that are on the Lusitania are live. The Guardian didn't tell us about that part.
Indeed, you can just read around the edge here that they were made by the armaments firm, the Bethlehem Steel Company in America in 1914.
And the Bethlehem Steel Company was part of the arms industry whose profits soared for the years of World War I. And in their case, to the tune of a 700% increase in profits. And we'll come back to them in a minute, but let's have a look at another aspect of the Lusitania's story that the Guardian didn't mention. And that's the original manifest, which was kept hidden from the public for decades following the disaster. From Life magazine, October 13th, 1972, when they published a feature about the Lusitania. And here they're mentioning the 1918 U.S. court case about the Lusitania, which was a liability suit brought on by the survivors and families of the victims against the Cunard Steamship Company, who owned the Lusitania. And from Life magazine, the absence of the true manifest impeded the American court case into the cause of the laws. But this did not prevent a verdict in favor of the Cunard and British Admiralty. The document was actually in President Wilson's possession, and he sealed it in an envelope and placed it in the Treasury archives, marked, quote, only to be opened by the President of the United States, end quote. By January 1940, Britain and America stood in a relationship almost identical to that of May 1915. On January 21st, President Franklin D. Roosevelt asked Edwin M. Watson, one of his secretaries, to bring him President Wilson's packet from the Treasury archives. The then Collector of Customs, Harry M. Durning, searched it out and handed it over. Watson sent it to the President with the following note. And here's a copy of that note, which states, Memorandum for the President. This is from Mr. Durney, and is the original manifest of the SS Lusitania. He wanted me to open it, but I was afraid to do it until you had seen it. I have thanked Mr. Durney. EMW. Edwin M. Watson. So how about that? President Wilson hid the original manifest away in the Treasury Department, where it stayed hidden for decades. And Life magazine also lets us know that these portions of the true manifest were kept secret until the 1950s. And we'll come back to that aspect, but let's have a look at the actual manifest and the portions that they're talking about. We saw from the Guardian article that in 1918, a New York judge had ruled that there were 4,200 cases of safety cartridges, 18 fuse cases, and 125 shrapnel cases, and that they did not constitute war munitions. And that 1918 New York judge was Judge Julius M. Mayer. And on the second page of the manifest we see the Bethlehem Steel Company. And they have a listing of the cases of shrapnel and fuses. And we see the 18 cases of fuses listed, but look at the cases of shrapnel. It says 1,250 cases, not 125 cases, as the article in The Guardian stated. And that is not a typo or a deliberate mistake on the part of The Guardian. While I haven't been able to track down an original copy of Judge Mayer's ruling, the website mslusitania.info has a transcribed version of the text, and in it we see, from Judge Mayer's original ruling, that he states that it's, quote, 125 shrapnel cases, end quote, but actually it's 1,250 cases of shrapnel, as we can see. Judge Mayer also notes that the shrapnel cases were, quote, consisting merely of empty shells, without any powder charge, end quote. Yeah. Here's what the shells look like. And on the left you can see the inside of the shells with no fuse attached, and on the right is a sealed one with the fuse and cover on it. And here's what a fully assembled round looks like, with the fuse being inserted here under the cover. And only 18 cases of fuses, huh? Remember, the divers brought up 821 of them, and they were live. There's likely many thousands more still down there. And about the shrapnel, quote, consisting of merely empty shells without any powder charge, end quote. Well, considering the cases of fuses were live, you know? Having a look at page 18 of the manifest, we see the 4,200 cases of cartridges. And those were shipped from the Remington Arms Union Metallic Cartridge Company, naturally. And remember, Judge Julius Mayer stated in his ruling that they were, quote, safety cartridges, end quote. And he said the same number of 4,200. And although the original manifest was hidden and tucked away at the Treasury Department, in the days following the sinking, a rather modified version of the manifest was given to the public in the newspapers. And on the list included, quote, cartridges and ammunition, 4,200, meaning cases. And note that they do say ammunition on this one, but they don't state the caliber or anything like that. Judge Julius Mayer said they were safety cartridges. And again, this is something the Guardian didn't mention in their 2014 article on the Lusitania, but back in 2008, a team of divers led by Greg Bemis found those so-called safety cartridges. Millions of rounds of them, as a matter of fact. These are .30 caliber .303s that are fired in rifles and machine guns. There's mountains of them all over the place. And here we can see a nicely fitted stack of them in their still decaying crate. Here's some footage from another dive by Greg Bemis and crew, where they sent down a submersible to retrieve some ammo. This dive was in 2011 with National Geographic on board, and they would release a documentary about the dive in 2012. And here's some more 303s brought up from the Lusitania. and once cleaned off, the head stamps show they're from the Remington Union Metallic Cartridge Company, with the U-15 V2 stamp indicating they come from the Bridgeport, Connecticut plant, manufactured in 1915 for the British government. And there's millions of them down there. To give you an idea of how big these are in comparison to a bullet used in a handgun, the .303 is the bullet highlighted in the background. They were primarily used in Lee Enfield rifles, and they could also be used in machine guns such as the mounted Vickers .303, with the ammunition being belt-fed. So the Lusitania was carrying millions of rounds of .303s made by Remington, and thousands of fuses that were live, and thousands of shells that allegedly contained no powder, and they were courtesy of the Bethlehem Steel Company. But here's how the official story went out to the public right from the start. Here's the report of the British inquiry about a month after the disaster, and it was headed by Lord Mersey, John Bingham. And he added an annex where he states the inquiry's conclusions. And about the Lusitania's cargo, he says, the cargo was a general cargo of the ordinary kind, but part of it contained a number of cases of cartridges, about 5,000. This ammunition was entered in the manifest. It was stowed well forward in the ship on the orlop and the lower decks, and about 50 yards away from where the torpedoes struck the ship. There was no other explosives on board. He didn't mention that there were thousands of fuses, and they were filled and live. And notice he mentioned it as torpedoes, plural, and we'll get to that aspect to be sure, but he also states that there was no other explosive on board. When the inquiry started, questioning the Lusitania's captain, William Turner, here's what the Attorney General, Edward Carson, said about the cargo. I will not go into the particulars of the crew and cargo, because we know what it was, except that it was never established what it was. And not only that, this has taken place on day one, at the very beginning of the inquiry. No one at all at this point in the public inquiry has been told what the cargo is. A little later on, there is mention of the cargo in this exchange between the Commissioner, Lord Mersey, and the Attorney General, Edward Carlson. The Commissioner, is there anything you want to call my attention to, Sir Edward, in the manifest? The Attorney General, there are, as your lordship will see if you look down the manifest, certain cases of ammunition and some empty shells, but no question has been asked hitherto as to them on that matter. The Commissioner, not shells to be utilized? The Attorney General, no, nor ammunition to be utilized. The ammunition was in cases, as you will see. That is the only thing which can have any materiality, but no suggestion has been made or asked as to this having had anything to do with the calamity. So what he's saying there is that only the ammunition could have any materiality or explosiveness. And he notes that it was stored in cases. And he also mentions, quote, some empty shells, end quote. And that's all you'd hear about the shells in the whole inquiry. And again, no mention of the fuses, or them being live. But he does make a point of saying how no one has asked or suggested that the munitions on board had anything to do with the sinking. And no official would, of course. And we'll come back to that point and the inquiry in a bit. But when it came to the cargo that was actually on board the Lusitania, we can see the lies in the cover-up taking shape right off the bat. And by 1918, from New York Judge Julius Mayer, the public would hear, the proof is absolute that she was not and never had been armed, nor did she carry any explosives. She did carry some 18 fuse cases and 125 shrapnel cases, consisting of merely empty shells without any powder. And he calls the ammunition 4,200 cases of safety cartridges. At least he mentioned that the Lusitania was carrying, quote, some 18 fuse cases, end quote, but of course not mentioning anything about them being live. But it's the, quote, 125 shrapnel cases merely consisting of empty shells without any powder, end quote, that gets me. Again, as we saw from the real manifest, it was 1,250 cases of artillery shells, listed as only shrapnel, not 125 cases. And there was 4 shells to a case, making 5,000 shells total. considering the amount of shrapnel that was kept hidden from the public and the downplay of the fuses, not mentioning them as being live either. I do wonder if the shells were full of powder? And why not? The fuses were. And with thousands of shells placed in the forward holds, perhaps they might be the cause of the second blast? They're my second choice for the most likely cause of the second massive explosion, by the way. It certainly was not a second torpedo, as we'll see. And of course we'll also get into what I believe is the most likely cause of the second explosion. But again, just like the British Inquirer under Lord Mersey 3 years earlier in 1915, in 1918, Judge Mayer's description of merely empty shells, only 18 fuse cases, and 4,200 cases of safety cartridges, doesn't exactly conjure up a mental picture of the true nature of the Lusitania's cargo, or the weapons they were destined to be used in. Now let's have a look at this article from CBS published in 2016. I won't read through it all, but you can pause and read should you like. And much like the Guardian article we looked at earlier, it's what CBS doesn't tell us about the Lusitania's story that I find very interesting. They do tell us that Owen McGarry has dived the wreck nearly 50 times, and we'll come back to him in a moment. They also tell us the British Navy didn't tell Captain Turner that U-20, the submarine that sunk her, was out there, something it knew, because Germany's codebooks had been captured and decoded at a top-secret facility called Room 40. Quote, one explanation is that Room 40 was absolutely top secret, and by God, they were going to keep it that way, end quote, said Larson. And that's Eric Larson, author of the book, Dead Weight. And he goes on to say, quote, but another explanation is that it would not hurt the British effort if the Lusitania were sunk and Americans were killed, because it might draw America into the war, end quote. Winston Churchill oversaw Room 40. Then head of the British Navy, First Lord of the Admiralty was his title. He was on record hoping for an incident that would drag the US into the war, something that wouldn't actually happen for another 2 years. Quote, there's no smoking memo, if you will, that says Churchill or the Admiralty deliberately put the Lusitania in harm's way, end quote, said Larson. Quote, there is, however, a body of evidence that, if you look at it, it is really damning, end quote. And you'll notice that CBS doesn't bother to tell us what any of that damning evidence is, of course. And we'll see that coming up. But moving along. McGarry, for one, doesn't believe the accepted conclusion that the second explosion was caused by the rupture of the ship's main steam line. She was carrying small arms munitions, but were there other explosives aboard? So first of all, I wonder whose quote accepted conclusion, end quote, they refer to. Must be their own, as there is no official conclusions at all, nor do they want any, as we'll see. And we'll also see coming up why it wasn't the ship's boilers blowing up that caused the second blast. Now secondly, notice that they mention the quote, small arms munitions, end quote, and what they don't mention is that they're 303s from Remington, and there's millions of them discovered in 2008. And they ask, but were there other explosives on board? While not mentioning the Bethlehem Steel Company's live fuses, or the artillery shells listed as shrapnel, empty or not. They don't bother mentioning those, do they? But they do say this. The Lusitania remains fodder for conspiracy theorists. And there you go. I'm sure the mainstream would consider me as a conspiracy theorist, and yet they're the ones not telling the complete picture now, are they? They do interview Eric Larson and give his book, Dead Weight, some promotion. And they finish off the article by saying, 100 years later, as time takes its toll, the truth only becomes more elusive. Yeah, in the warped world of the official mainstream narrative CBS lives in, I suppose. But the reality is exactly the opposite. As more and more time has gone on, more information has come to light, more discoveries have been made, and access to that information has vastly improved over the last century. So with this CBS article, like the Guardian article we looked at earlier, it's the stuff they don't tell us that I find particularly interesting. And in both cases, they don't tell us that the small arms munitions, or safety cartridges, were millions of rounds of 303s. Nor do they mention the fuses being live. And while the Guardian did mention Judge Mayer's ruling of 125 shrapnel shells, If I know from the real manifest that it was actually 1,250 cases of shells, I'm sure they did too, and they didn't mention that, whereas CBS didn't mention them at all. And here's something else I find very interesting, considering they interviewed Owen McGarry in the CBS article. Not only did they not mention the 2008 dive that found millions of rounds of 303s, but it was Owen McGarry himself that led that 2008 dive that made the find. And yet CBS doesn't even mention that when doing an interview with him. And something else I noticed, neither article even mentioned a word of Greg Bemis, a retired venture capitalist and diver himself, who sadly passed away this past May 2020 at the age of 91, about a week shy of his 92nd birthday. He partly owned the Lusitania's remains since the 1960s, and they became the outright owner since 1982. He's financed several of the dives and done dives himself to the site, and has been the major driving force in trying to bring up absolute proof of what caused the second massive explosion that completely submerged the ship in only 18 minutes. And I find it rather telling that neither The Guardian or CBS News even mention him in their articles. We also see in the article from the Irish Examiner that Owen McGarry was a, quote, close friend, end quote, of Greg Bemis. That's who they're talking about in that part of the article. So CBS would interview Owen McGarry in 2016, but not make a mention of Greg Bemis. Interesting. And I'll venture to say, that's probably because of what Greg Bemis represents, getting at the truth. Now let's have a quick look at Stanford Magazine's May-June 2015 feature article on the Lusitania. And to note, for people who don't know, Stanford Magazine is published by Stanford University. And they tell us, in 1982, Greg Bemis made the cheapest and most expensive financial transaction of his career. For $1, he acquired full ownership of the RMS Lusitania. Going back, the wreckage was owned by the Liverpool War Risk Insurance Association, and in 1967 they held a silent auction, and it was bought by American John Light. And shortly after his purchase, Light needed funding, and this is when George McHomer and Greg Bemis would hop on board, earning Bemis a 1/3 share of the ship, and John Light would eventually drop out of the venture, leaving Bemis and McHomer as the sole owners. And by 1982, McHomer would drop out, selling his half to Bemis for $1, making Greg Bemis the sole owner. And in 1982, Greg Bemis would begin planning a salvage operation. And that's the same salvage operation that we saw earlier in that article from The Guardian, that in 1982 sparked alarm across the British government, and they were worried that explosives might be found. Greg Bemis is also a staunch defender of Captain Turner. He hopes to locate the captain's safe containing secret orders that would exonerate him. Quote, he had secret orders that could only be read once out in the water. He never revealed those orders in court. He was a total gentleman. Turner was not incompetent. I think he was an excellent man. End quote. Bemis has also had to go to court several times in Britain, Ireland, and the United States over ownership and access to the wreck. The Irish government has proved to be Bemis's biggest and longest-running opponent. In 1995, after some dubious innuendos against Greg Bemis, the Irish government, through the Minister of Arts, imposed a heritage order labeling the Lusitania a war grave site that must be protected. And after 12 long years of litigation, Bemis would win the right to access the wreck after the case made it to the Irish Supreme Court in 2007. But winning the right to access the wreckage and actually being allowed to access the wreckage are two different things. As we can see from the Irish Times 7 years later on May 7th, 2014. In an interview with Greg Bemis, he states, "The government's continued attempt to tie my hands when all I'm trying to do is resolve major questions around this sinking makes the diving licenses worthless." So, the government of Ireland, like the British government and the American government before it, have been continuing a trend of hindering and hampering Greg Bemis's efforts. And we see that some mainstream media entities such as CBS News or The Guardian don't even want to mention him. Nor do they appear to want to talk about the true nature of the cargo the Lusitania was carrying, leaving us to find such information in lesser known or sometimes controversial publications. But I do want to point out History.com, to their credit, tells us that there was 1,250 cases of shrapnel shells. So good for them on that count anyways. But I have to say, overall, trying to get the truth about the Lusitania's story through modern media outlets proves to be very disappointing. So let's go back 50 years to what I call the golden age of media and dig a bit deeper into that Life magazine feature on the Lusitania and learn some more startling truths. Historically, the British Admiralty relied on Britain's passenger liners to double as auxiliary cruisers in wartime. In 1903, it entered into a secret agreement with the Cunard Steamship Company, in which the Admiralty agreed to finance the entire cost of two liners, the Mauretania and the Lusitania. In return, Cunard had to promise that control of the company was never to pass out of British hands, and that in time of war, their entire fleet was to be placed under Admiralty command. Cunard also had to agree that the Admiralty could specify the design and construction of the ships. The design brief presented to Cunard's chief designer, Leonard Pesca, was for a floating hotel with accommodations for 2,300 guests and a staff of 900. The ship had to be capable of crossing the Atlantic at 24 knots and of mounting 12 6-inch guns. This meant building high, higher than a ship had ever been built before. In February 1913, Alfred Booth, Cunard's chairman, was invited to present himself to the Board of Admiralty. The First Lord, Winston Churchill, left Booth in no doubt that there was shortly to be war with Germany. The estimated date for its outbreak was September 1914. Therefore, he had decided that in the national interest, it was the correct time to implement certain of the clauses by which Cunard had agreed to make the ships available to the Admiralty. He expressed a wish that the Lusitania, the Mauretania, the Ivernia, and the Aquitania, then under construction, be modified forthwith, so that should hostilities break out, they could, without delay, take up their role as armed cruisers. Under strict secrecy, the Lusitania entered dry dock at Liverpool on May 12, 1913. The entire length of the vessel, between the shelter deck and below the upper deck, a depth of 14 feet 6 inches, was double-plated and hydraulically riveted. The reserve coal bunker immediately forward of number 1 boiler room was converted into a magazine. Special shell rocking was installed so that the shells rested against the bulkheads, and handling lifts were installed. A second magazine was converted from part of the mailrooms at the stern of the ship, and revolving gun rings were mounted on the forecastle and on the aft deck, so that each deck could mount 2 6-inch quick-firing guns. When war was declared on August 4, 1914, the Lusitania was again moved into dry dock. Her armament of 12 6-inch guns was installed, and on September 17th, she entered the Admiralty Fleet Register as an armed auxiliary cruiser, and was so entered in the Cunard ledgers. The Lusitania was ready for war. On the morning of May 5, 1915, Churchill was in a hurry. He had a train to catch to Paris. His discussions with Fisher and Admiral Oliver, Chief of the Naval War Staff, were brief. The three of them went down to the map room of the Admiralty, where one side of the room was and is covered by a great map of the world measuring some 30 feet by 20 feet. Since September 1914, the Admiralty had been in possession of the German naval ciphers, and from February 1915, a chain of interception and direction-finding stations established around the English and Irish coasts had enabled naval intelligence not only to read almost every German naval signal, but also to pinpoint where it came from. Marked on the Great Map were the approximate positions of almost every unit of the German Navy, together with the ships of the Allied navies. Admiral Oliver dealt with each operational area in turn. When he came to the western approaches, he pointed out the red squares marking the U-30 and the U-20, the former heading north and by now well to the north of Ireland, and the latter sighted a few miles to the northwest of Fastnet. He explained that the war staff had, on their own initiative, altered the disposition of some of the cruisers as a result of the U-20's activities. Looming large on the map in the area of Fastnet were the red square denoting the U-20, the large disc of the cruiser Juno, and the largest disc of them all, which represented the Lusitania. If the U-20 remained stationary, it would meet the Lusitania at dawn the following morning, with the Juno in the area close by. If the U-20 turned west, then the rendezvous would be even sooner. Admiral Oliver drew to Churchill's attention the fact that the Juno was unsuitable for exposure to submarine attack without escort, and suggested that elements of the destroyer flotilla from Milford Haven should be sent forthwith to her assistance. At this juncture, the Admiralty War Diary stopped short, perhaps understandably, as it was here that the decision was taken that was to be the direct cause of the disaster. No one alive today knows who took it, but shortly after noon on May 5th, the Admiralty signaled the Juno to abandon her mission and return to Queenstown. They did not dispatch any destroyers, and the Lusitania was not informed that she was now alone and closing every minute with the U-20. Undoubtedly a signal was sent, but 2 cables from Queenstown to the Admiralty on May 7th appear to be missing from the Admiralty signal register, and Coke's log cannot be traced. Fortunately, a certified copy of the transmission log of the naval station at Valencia has survived, and this clearly shows that the Lusitania received a 12-word message in naval code addressed to Mercantile Fleet Auxiliary at 11:02 Greenwich Mean Time, which was promptly acknowledged by the Lusitania with the code word of the day, quote, Westrona, end quote. The message was taken to Captain Turner, who took some time to decode it, as it was the first he had ever received in that code. To the end of his life, he was adamant it instructed him to divert into Queenstown. At noon, Schwager, who was the captain of the submarine, heard the throb of propellers above him, and came up to periscope depth and saw the Juno heading away from him into Queenstown. He also noticed that the sun was fully out and the fog had cleared. After a 20-minute delay to give Juno time to get clear, Schwager surfaced and headed back toward Fastnet at full speed. 40 miles away was the Lusitania, and Captain Turner had finished decoding Coke's Mercantile Fleet Auxiliary signal a few minutes before. At 12:15 Greenwich Mean Time, he swung the Lusitania to port and headed for the shore. And 2 hours later, disaster would strike. And within a dozen or more seconds from the torpedo hit, there was a second massive explosion. And the huge liner would do the unthinkable and completely submerge in only 18 minutes. Amid the international uproar which greeted the disaster, 2 groups of men were carefully planning how to conceal the truth. In the British Admiralty, care was taken to prepare a case against Captain Turner, and it was denied that the critical wireless signal, which he claimed had told him to divert to Queenstown, had ever been sent. Lord Mersey, who had been appointed as the judge to conduct the court of inquiry, was sent a letter by a High Admiralty official telling him that it was, quote, considered politically expedient that Captain Turner, the master of the Lusitania, be most prominently blamed for the disaster, end quote. Lord Fisher had decided, on the basis of false evidence laid before him, that Turner was, quote, not a fool, but knave, end quote, and had probably been bribed by the Germans. Churchill concurred in this decision. The American consul in Queenstown, Wesley Frost, had succeeded in obtaining affidavits from every American survivor, and these were forwarded by him to the State Department and to the Board of Trade in London. It says much for the attitude of both institutions that not one of the series of 35 affidavits was ever used in either the British or American inquiries. The State Department cleared their archive for public inspection in 1965, but of the copies sent to the Board of Trade, no trace remains except the acknowledgement to Mr. Frost of their safe receipt. The Board of Trade took depositions on oath from every one of the 289 members of the crew who survived. Only 13 of these are available at the Public Record Office, and they all possess a curious lack of originality. Without exception, even those signed with the mark by an illiterate seaman, they place the torpedo's impact as well aft, amidships, or both. Similarly, each one commences with the sentences, quote, at the time of sailing, the ship was in good order and well founded. The vessel was unarmed and possessed no weapons for offense or defense against an enemy, and she has never carried such equipment. Boat drill was carried out before leaving New York, end quote. On this unanimous testimony, the Board of Trade based their inquiry. Lord of Mercy discovered that he had been misled by the government and returned a verdict clearing Captain Turner. Quote, he exercised his judgment for the best. It was the judgment of a skilled and experienced man, and although others might have acted differently and perhaps more successfully, he ought not, in my opinion, to be blamed. End quote. The rest of Mercy's verdict assisted the government. He dutifully found that there had been no explosions on the Lusitania, except at least 2 torpedoes, and that she was carrying neither contraband nor troops. 2 days after delivering his verdict, he refused his fee for the case and asked to be excused from ever sitting again as a judge. The Lusitania case, he told his children, quote, was a damned dirty business, end quote. In the United States, the administration went to extraordinary lengths to conceal the true nature of the cargo and the lax attitude toward the shipping of contraband. State Department records show that Lansing was the prime architect of this policy, and when Secretary Bryan resigned in protest over the administration's handling of the case and concealment of the truth, Lansing took his place. The political dialogue between America and Germany dragged on into 1917, and history records that the matter was never settled, as the dispute was still raging when the U.S. entered the war. Now, before we go to the next part of this Life magazine article, they did tell us some information about the British Admiralty's Room 40, and this is actually a picture of Room 40 taken in 1919. But how it came into being was on August 25, 1914, Germany's SMS Magdeburg grounded on the rocks in Russian territory, and by the next day, the Russians had Germany's naval codebook safely in hand. And being allies with the British at this early stage of the war, they would send a copy of it to the British, and by October 13, 1914, Winston Churchill himself would be handed the German codebook. And Churchill and the British Admiralty would create the ultra-secret Room 40, and for the next few years they could, and did, listen in on all German submarine transmissions, allowing the British Admiralty to know where all the subs were, where they were going, and what they were up to. And this is how they knew on May 5th, 2 days before the Lusitania was sunk, that the Lusitania was on a collision course with German submarine U-20. And yet Churchill and the British Admiralty did nothing. Now, something Life magazine probably didn't know back in 1972 was that on February 12, 1915, Winston Churchill wrote a letter to the President of the English Board of Trade, saying that it was, quote, most important to attract neutral shipping to our shores, in the hope especially of embroiling the USA with Germany. For our part, we want the traffic. The more the better, and if some of it gets into trouble, better still. So how about that? Gives you a little bit of insight into how Churchill was thinking back then. And in my opinion, it explains quite a lot of the actions and lack of action taken in regards to the Lusitania. I searched around trying to find a copy of the original letter, but didn't have any luck, and could only find it in places like the New Yorker or the Daily Mail, or some books. And not that I don't believe those sources or anything like that, but I just wanted to see it with my own eyes. And I came across this, from the Churchill Center International Churchill Societies, and they talk about the New Yorker article we just looked at, saying, John Updike's Remember the Lusitania in the July 1st New Yorker reminded us of what Churchill said. And then they tell us the exact same quote. And they follow that up by saying, we are left with an indiscreet remark in a private letter, testifying mainly to Churchill's curious determination to win wars, which letter Mr. Updike wouldn't even know about had the Churchill family kept the papers locked up. And they finish by saying, we could do with more of Churchill's indiscretion and determination at the moment. Like, really? What the fuck? Churchill only had a curious determination to win wars? And we could do with more of that indiscretion and determination at the moment? And what exactly was going on at the moment? The New Yorker article came out in July of 2002, and that was right in the middle of the propaganda built-up to the invasion of Iraq in March of 2003. So it wouldn't take too long for the editor to get his wished-for indiscretions and curious determinations to win wars, now would it? But anyways, we see that Churchill in February of 1915 was hoping to get the United States into the war with Germany, And if it took some of the shipping to get into, quote, trouble, then better still. And then we see on May 5th that Churchill and the British Admiralty knew the Lusitania was on a course heading right towards the submarine U-20, and they did nothing. And now check out what happened on May 7th, in the hours before the Lusitania was sunk. President Wilson's personal representative, Colonel Edward Mandell House, and he was over in London on May 7th representing President Wilson, trying to broker a peace deal, and not having very much luck at it too, I might add. And the colonel part of it is only an honorary title, kind of like Colonel Sanders. But unlike Colonel Sanders, who did serve in the military, though he didn't rise to the rank of colonel, Edward House didn't serve in the military. But anyways, Colonel E.M. House of Texas called on the British Foreign Secretary Sir Edward Grey shortly after breakfast on May 7th. At noon, House was to have an audience with King George V, and Grey would accompany him. Grey had asked House to call early as he wished to take the opportunity for a, quote, short talk, end quote. They drove to Kew Gardens to see the almond blossoms. As they walked, Grey suddenly stopped still and said, apropos of nothing, quote, what will America do if the Germans sink an ocean liner with American passengers on board, end quote. And that was about 4 or 5 hours before the Lusitania would be sunk. And now check this out. The king received Colonel House most graciously, and they made small talk. As he stood looking out of the window, one hand toying with some papers on a desk, the king suddenly remarked, quote, Colonel, what will America do if the Germans sink the Lusitania, end quote. And that was a little bit under 2 hours before the Lusitania was sunk. And all these statements and actions from Winston Churchill and the British Admiralty to the British Foreign Secretary to the King are all one big coincidence? Winston Churchill would go on to lie about the Lusitania for years to come, as we'll see. And again I tried to find an original copy of these statements, and I actually did, but unfortunately I forgot to download it, and then I couldn't find it again. The statements are found in Colonel House's diaries, and I did find that the University of Yale does have copies of it in their archives, which they write about in this article. And I also found it published in 1936 in this thesis by James W. Taylor. So I have no doubts that these conversations took place, and that they took place when they did only adds to the nefarious mysteries of the true nature of the Lusitania's sinking. And if you think everything you've seen so far has been surprising or shocking, it's actually just the tip of the iceberg. And now we're going to take an even deeper dive into it all, and perhaps maybe even find the actual truth of some things. Construction on the Lusitania began in 1904. The superstructure was launched on June 7, 1906. And here you can get an idea of just how huge this ship is. And note that its 4 funnels are yet to be installed. And here she is completed and sailing away. Now, was the Lusitania armed? Germany certainly thought she was. And we can see in their reply to a letter sent by President Wilson demanding answers. Germany's position was that the Lusitania was built as an auxiliary cruiser. The British naval lists referred to her as a warship, and that she had 2 guns mounted, although concealed below decks. And they also said most British steamers have repeatedly carried soldiers, artillery, war supplies, and contraband. And that she carried 5,400 cases of cartridges, other war supplies, and Canadian troops. And they also stated, Germany then calls attention to the fact that there are American laws that prohibit, in unmistakable terms, the carrying on merchant vessels which also carry passengers any sort of munitions of war. So Germany claims the Lusitania was indeed armed with at least 2 guns that were concealed below decks, which of course British and American officials completely denied. On May 8, 1915, the day after the Lusitania was sunk, we see officials at the State Department said they had not heard that the Lusitania carried any guns. At the British Embassy, it was revealed that early in the war, after the United States government had been consulted on the question of small guns for big liners, the advice was given by the State Department, and heeded, that no guns be carried on the decks. So was the advice indeed, quote, heeded? The British kept the existence of their secret code-breaking Room 40 hidden from the American government and the world until the late 1920s. So keeping things hidden from the American government in this time period wouldn't be a first. And something to keep in mind is that unlike today, where it's easy to see Britain and the US as nothing but the strongest of allies, that wasn't exactly the case back in 1915. And that's not to say they weren't friendly towards each other or anything like that. But the people living in 1915 were closer to the War of 1812, where they were enemies, than they are to us today, where we're all the closest of allies. Anyways, on May 10th, 1915, we would see Herman Winter, who was head of the passenger department of the Cunard Steamship Company, would say, "It is true that she had aboard 4,200 cases of cartridges, but they were cartridges for small arms, packed in separate cases, and could not have injured the vessel by exploding. They certainly do not come under the classification of ammunition. The United States authorities would not permit us to carry ammunition, classified as such by the military authorities, on a passenger liner." So you know he's a bullshitter right away. And he goes on. The Lusitania had 1,250 shrapnel cases, but they were empty. There was no explosive of any sort aboard. As to the report that the Lusitania had guns aboard, I cannot assert too strongly that it is positively untrue. There were no guns whatever aboard. The Lusitania was an unarmed passenger steamer. Furthermore, she never has been armed and never carried an unmounted gun or rifle out of port in times of war or peace. Now, if we have a look through the Lansing papers, from the files of then Secretary of State Robert Lansing, we see a letter sent on June 4th, 1915, so just 3 weeks after the Lusitania went down, from the Collector of Customs of the Port of New York, Dudley Field Malone, to the Secretary of the Treasury, William Gibb McAdoo. And don't forget, the Treasury Department is where the Lusitania's original manifest was kept hidden until 1940. But anyways, William McAdoo had previously sent Dudley Malone a series of questions, and in this letter here we can see Dudley Malone's answers, which he tells McAdoo, "I shall answer in the order of your submission." And the first question asked was, did she or not have guns on board, mounted on the underdecks and masked? And Dudley Malone's reply is that she did not have any guns of any caliber or description on any deck or decks, on her stern or bow, mounted or unmounted, masked or unmasked. And he says he makes that statement of his own official knowledge, and based upon the statements of other people who he names that were in charge of discharging the cargo. And considering what we now know about the cargo, I don't put too much faith in the words of the people who are in charge of discharging that cargo. But he also did say that he based the statements on his own official knowledge. So let's have a look at what that would be. And he says, in addition, I myself boarded the steamship Lusitania on the morning of May 1st, 1915, within 1 hour of the time of her actual departure. And after an inspection of her open bow deck and open stern deck, I can testify of my own personal knowledge that there were no guns of any character, blah 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 blah. And that's his evidence. He walked around for an hour or less and didn't see anything. 11 days after that, on June 15th, 1915, at the British Inquiry being run by Lord Mersey. And in his rulings, he would say the ship was unarmed, carried no masked guns, or was violating any laws of the United States. They would also ask the Lusitania's captain, William Turner, if the ship was armed or not during the hearings. And he would answer, of course, that the ship was completely unarmed. So what we have is Germany saying that the ship was an armed auxiliary cruiser, while Britain and America were both saying that the ship was completely unarmed. And with the ship now being 300 feet below the waves, and technology being what it was at the time, there was just no way to get down there and prove it one way or another. Or maybe there was? But before we have a look at that, let's have a look at this. A book written by one of the Lusitania's survivors, Charles E. Laureat Jr., published in 1915, and of course he wasn't selected to give any testimony at the British Inquiry, and perhaps that in part prompted him to write this book. I don't know. But he does give us some startling information in his book. On page 65 he tells us, The plans of the Lusitania here reproduced are from Engineering, London, in the issue for May 14th, 1915. And in the next couple of pages, we can see the deck plans for the Lusitania. And when you take a close look, you can see things sticking out of the sides of the decks. And there's a very interesting cargo hold in the bottom starboard side, up near the bow. Now, because it's a book, the resolution isn't very good. But thankfully from the archives, we can have a look at another version with a higher resolution. And when we look at the promenade deck, or deck B, we see 4 6-inch guns. And if we look about a third of the way along the shelter deck, or deck C, we see a couple of 6-inch QF guns, or quick firing guns. And if we look at the back half of deck C, towards the stern, we see the other 6 guns, and they're all 6-inch QF guns, making a total of 12 6-inch guns, just like Life magazine said. And in that compartment in the bottom cargo holds on the starboard side, up near the bow of the ship, that I mentioned previously, we can see it's the magazine, or shell room. So that's pretty interesting, especially considering that's where many of the survivors say that's the general area of the second blast. Now, something else to consider was the secret British Q-ship program, where Britain secretly outfitted thousands of ships with hidden guns, like the HMS Stockforce shown here. Ships of every shape and size were transformed. Trawlers, steamers, which the Lusitania was, schooners, and cargo ships were all transformed secretly into men of war. And I can't help but wonder if the Q from James Bond was inspired by the Q ships of World War I.
Miss Moneypenny, ask the equipment officer to come in, please. Q branch has put together a smart-looking piece of luggage for us. We're issuing this to all WO personnel.
An ordinary black leather case with 20 rounds of ammunition here and here.
Anyways, notice one of the strategies written about in the BBC article. The idea was to lure the U-boat into attacking these decoy ships, which would unleash their hidden weaponry. And an excellent example of this strategy would be found in the HMS Farnborough, a Q ship that was sacrificed to sink the German submarine U-83. Simply put, the captain altered his course to allow the torpedo to hit his ship, and when the submarine surfaced, the Farnborough fired 45 shells into her, sinking her. But of course the cost of this exchange was also the HMS Farnborough as well. Much like Q from James Bond, the British Q ships of World War I would come up with ingenious ways to hide weaponry aboard the ships. Like here's an example of a gun popping up from below decks. Or here in this uncovered lifeboat we see a gun, only it's not a lifeboat. If we look at the walls of the so-called lifeboat from the other side, we see they pop out, allowing the gun to swivel out. Here's the HMS Hyderabad, another Q ship. And here we can see the Hyderabad dressed, ready for action. And on the bow you can see its gun raised and on display. And here's where and how they kept that gun hidden. Here's where they've hidden a bomb thrower. And inside this false cabin with collapsible walls is a 4-inch gun. So was the Lusitania armed as Life magazine has told us? I think the only proof we'll actually find is laying in the bottom of the ocean and disintegrating. But when I consider all the other lies told about the Lusitania, why should I believe them on this? Now you may have heard the whole world was shocked when Germany sank the Lusitania, and when I first began digging into the Lusitania's story, this is how I also understood things as well. But the deeper and deeper I dove into it, and the more I discovered and learned, left me feeling kind of shocked that they were shocked. From the Toronto Globe, Saturday, August 8th, 1914, so just a few days after Britain declared war on Germany, and 9 months before the sinking of the Lusitania. We see the Lusitania was warned by the Essex, another British ship. And that warning was that the German cruiser Dresden had received orders to be on the watch for, and if possible, intercept the big Cunarder, meaning the Lusitania. And we see the same news on the same day from the Pittsburgh Press, with them telling us that the Dresden was waiting near the regular line, intending to intercept her. And here's a picture of the Dresden, and here's a close-up of one of her guns. So 9 months before the sinking of the Lusitania, that was stalking her. And then we see on February 7th, 1915, 3 months before the sinking, the Lusitania flies the Stars and Stripes to escape the Germans. The Lusitania sailed from New York and arrived at Liverpool, flying the American flag. Then we see a month later, on March 6, 1915, so now 2 months before the sinking of the Lusitania, the Lusitania again runs German gauntlet safely. It was reported that German submarine commanders were on the alert to attack the big Cunarder. So I'm not exactly sold that the world was shocked, considering Germany was after the Lusitania for up to 9 months before the sinking. And by this point it was pretty much common knowledge that the Lusitania was carrying war supplies to the British and French. It's my belief that what most people found shocking was the speed in which the Lusitania went down, and of course the number of people that went down with her as well. Now before we leave this article, have a look at the headline, Liner in Flames. And that's the French passenger liner La Touraine, pictured here. And she caught on fire 700 miles off the French coast while carrying 284 people. And that's not all she carried. As we can see here, La Touraine carried munitions for the Allies. She was carrying 4,594 cases of cartridges when she left New York. What a coincidence. And have a look at this. In shipping circles, the fear was expressed that if flames reach the hold in which the cartridges are stored, a bad explosion will result. You don't say. That's quite the opposite of what Herman Winter of the Cunard Steamship Company would say 2 months later about the Lusitania. And further, we see, officials of the French company told a United Press reporter that there were no munitions of war aboard. But her manifest showed that in addition to the supply of cartridges, she carried 139 rapid firearms, which is another term for the QF quick firing guns, like the 18-pounder QF field gun shown here. Ultimately, all the passengers were saved, as was the ship itself. But the similarities are noted. A passenger liner carrying war materials for the Allies, leaving from New York, which was indeed against American laws. And here's something else interesting. If you go to the Wikipedia page on the SS La Touraine, there's no mention of anything we've just looked at on the page. Now, let's go to New York City, Pier 54, on Saturday, May the 1st, 1915, the day the Lusitania set sail for her fatal final voyage. And this is actual footage of the passengers arriving to board the Lusitania that day. And sadly, most of them would end up in a watery grave in another 6 days. Now, something that most passengers didn't know about until they had already arrived and boarded the ship was that all the newspapers in New York and other cities around the country had an advertisement placed in them from the German embassy as a warning to all travelers. Notice, travelers intending to embark on the Atlantic voyage are reminded that a state of war exists between Germany and her allies, and Great Britain and her allies, that the zone of war includes the waters adjacent to the British Isles, that in accordance with formal notice given by the Imperial German government, vessels flying the flag of Great Britain or any of her allies are liable to destruction in those waters, and that travelers sailing in the war zone on the ships of Great Britain or her allies do so at their own risk. And notice the Brooklyn Daily Eagle, like many of the newspapers, put the German embassy's ad right next to the Cunard Steamship Company's ad with their upcoming schedules for their cruises. Over in Washington, on the same day, May 1st, 1915, the Washington Times placed the German warning on the front page. And below that, they tell us that the warning was published in all the New York newspapers today. And like I say, most passengers wouldn't sit down and read the newspaper until they had already boarded, got their room, and maybe then went up to the smoking lounge to relax and then read the newspaper. But it is true that most passengers would just shrug it off and not be worried about it. As we saw, the Lusitania was winning the game of cat and mouse against Germany for the last 9 months at least. And most people just figured that the Lusitania was too fast for the Germans to catch. Now if you'll notice something, the original ad placed by the German embassy was dated April 22nd, 1915. So why did it not appear in the newspapers until May the 1st, the day the Lusitania was set to sail? And if we look to Book 1 of Franklin Delano Roosevelt's Life and Times, 1882 to 1921, we see something very interesting. In talking about the warning advertisement placed in the newspapers by the German embassy, we see, on April 22nd, they, the German embassy, ordered a conspicuous warning placed in 50 newspapers. This would have given the public a week's notice. However, a State Department's officer ordered the warning's publication suppressed. On April 26th, George Viereck, representing the Germans, obtained an audience with Secretary of State, William Jennings Bryan. Bryan immediately cleared the notice for publication, and yet it would still take until May the 1st to actually appear. And not that I know or anything, but that State Department officer who ordered the advertisement suppressed, I'll bet, is either Robert Lansing himself or somebody connected to him, as he proves to be something of a war hawk and has no problems with the cover-up of it all. Now looking back again at the evening edition of the Washington Times on May the 1st, 1915, the day the Lusitania sailed out of New York, we see another set of warnings sent to a bunch of the prominent passengers. Scores of prominent passengers who sailed today on the giant Cunard Lusitania found anonymous telegrams awaiting them at the pier giving them warning that the Lusitania would be sunk on her trip to Liverpool. Alfred G. Vanderbilt was told in one of those messages that the vessel would be torpedoed. Other passengers were warned that the liner would meet some mysterious end. And then we see Cunard line officials laughed at the passengers' fears and said the Lusitania could show her heels to any submarine. Now fast forward to the day of the sinking on Friday, May 7th. And we're reminded that some of the prominent passengers had received mysterious telegrams warning them not to take passage aboard the Lusitania because she was doomed to destruction. Here is a copy of a telegram of warning received by Mr. Vanderbilt. Have it on definite authority, the Lusitania is to be torpedoed. You had better cancel passage immediately. But then the next day, on May 8th, 1915, we see in the New York Times that the Cunard officials now deny that these warnings were sent. When officials of the Cunard line were questioned concerning the reported anonymous telegrams, they said that investigation of the rumor was made before the liner sailed, and that it was ascertained that not one of the passengers named had received of any kind, from any source, as to any danger traveling by the Lusitania might entail. This denial was repeated at the Cunard Line offices yesterday. And I wonder if those were the same officials who a week earlier were laughing about it. At any rate, the BS and the cover-up are only just beginning. And speaking of which, have a look at this. On May 5th, it says May 6th because that's when the press release went out from London, but on May 5th, the Earl of Latham was sunk by a German submarine off Kinsale. And that German submarine, of course, was U-20. And then on May 6th at 11 a.m., the U-20 sunk the HMS Candidate. And then a couple hours later, at 1 p.m., while traveling back along the Irish coast again, the U-20 sunk the HMS Centurion, making 3 sinkings in 2 days leading up to May 7th. And notice the first sinking of the Earl of Latham was off of Kinsale, which I find very interesting because it's only 2 days later that the Lusitania would be sunk in the same spot. And here's something else very interesting. As we can see, by May 7th, the news of all 3 sinkings of the Earl of Latham the HMS Candidate, and the HMS Centurion had reached the American newspapers, and yet the Lusitania, who was scheduled to be sailing right through these waters in the mornings of May 7th, wasn't told a thing about any of these sinkings. From the British Inquiry, we can see what messages they did get. And they're asking Captain Turner, on the 6th of May, did you get a wireless telegram to the effect that submarines were active off the south coast of Ireland? To which he replies, I did. Did you also get on May 6th the message saying, take Liverpool pilot at bar and avoid headlands? And Captain Turner replies, I did. Pass harbors at full speed, steer mid-channel course? And again he replies, yes. And then he's asked, submarines at Fastnet? And Captain Turner replies, yes. On the 7th, did you get this? Submarines active in southern part of Irish Channel. Last heard of 20 miles south of Conning light vessel. And Captain Turner replies, I did. And that's the information the Lusitania got. They were told nothing of the 3 sinkings in the 2 days previous in the waters they were headed towards. They were only told on May 6th that submarines were active off the south coast of Ireland, and that submarines were at Fastnet. And on May 7th they were again told that submarines were active in the southern part of the Irish Channel, last heard of 20 miles south of the Conning light vessel. Here's where Fastnet Rock is, which is the lighthouse. And here's roughly where the Conning light vessel was moored, which was a lighthouse attached to a ship. And while the Lusitania was warned that submarines were active in these areas, like I say, I find it very interesting that they weren't told about the 3 ships that were sunk 2 days previous to their own sinking, especially when the Lusitania was sunk in the very spot that the Earl of Latham was sunk, just south of Kinsale. Now to his credit, the Cunard Steamship Company's chairman, Alfred Booth, after reading his morning newspaper on May the 7th and finding out what happened to the HMS Candidate and the HMS Centurion, he did try to warn the Lusitania. From the British Inquiry, we can see he was asked by the Attorney General, Edward Carson, what ships were they? And he replies, 2 steamers of the Harrison Line, the Candidate and the Centurion, I think they were. They had been sunk the previous day, I think. They had been sunk the previous day. Did you take steps to send a message to the Lusitania to inform them on board of that fact? And Alfred Booth replies, yes. And he explains that he immediately went to the Admiralty in Liverpool to get them to send a message to the Lusitania. And Attorney General Edward Carson asks, but I think you are of opinion, having regard to the time when you asked that should be done, the information could not have arrived in time? And Alfred Booth responds, I think it did not arrive in time. And as a matter of fact, it did not arrive at all. Cunard's chairman Alfred Booth was meeting with Rear Admiral Harry Stillman with the British Admiralty. And by this point, First Lord of the British Admiralty Winston Churchill was on his way to Paris. But the Admiralty already knew that the U-20 was patrolling in those waters. And by the time Alfred Booth had come to them on May 7th, asking them to send a message to the Lusitania, they already knew that it was the U-20 that sunk those 3 ships, though it would take a few more days to get final confirmation, as when the U-20 was rampaging along the Irish coast for a few days, she was out of signal range and wasn't sending any messages. And we see from Eric Larson's dead wake, on May 12th, wireless stations in Britain's listening network intercepted a series of messages from the then homebound U-20, which upon entering the North Sea had resumed communications with its base. In the first message of the series, Schweiger, the U-boat commander, reported, quote, have sunk off the south coast of Ireland, 1 sailing ship, 2 steamers, and Lusitania. And how they knew that already was of course thanks to Room 40. And I haven't been able to track down a copy of the Room 40 ledger books yet, and they were at one time up on the Lusitania.net site, but unfortunately have been removed since, leaving us only the index page of the Room 40 ledger book on German submarine U-20. But even with just that, we can see some pretty interesting stuff. Like on April 17th, they knew the U-20 was headed towards the Irish Sea. And then over the next couple of weeks, Room 40 was listening into the U-20's transmissions and taking note of her positions all along the way. And then below that, we see the entries listed for the 3 ships the U-20 sank on May 5th to May 6th. And below that, we see the entry for the Lusitania's sinking. Now let's have a look at the secret orders that were sent by the British Admiralty to Captain Turner on the Lusitania that have never been revealed to the public, right up to this day. And at the beginning of the public British inquiry, Attorney General Edward Carson talks about it in his opening statements, saying, "The morning upon which these people were murdered, there was certain specific information and directions sent out by the Admiralty by wireless telegraphy to the Lusitania, and which, so as far as I know, reached the captain." He then goes on to say that the information and directions in the message can't be made public. And this was a ruling from the Commissioner, Lord Mersey, done in a secret meeting before the public proceedings began. Now on the same day of the hearings, one of the lawyers, Mr. Rose Innes, was questioning Captain Turner. And we see in question number 123, he turned to the Commissioner, Lord Mersey, and stated, "The other questions I desire to put are such as cannot be put at the present moment, having regard to your Lordship's ruling." And Lord Mersey states, "I do not know what that means. What does it mean?" And Mr. Rose Innes replies, "They have reference to the Admiralty instructions," to which Lord Mersey responds, "I shall not, I think, allow you to put any questions about that." So Mr. Rose Innes wants to ask something that had something to do with the Admiralty instructions that the public wasn't allowed to know about, and Lord Mersey swatted him down and didn't want to hear his question. So, a couple weeks later in private hearings, we see Captain William Turner's recalled. And we see Mr. Rose Innes again, and he says, "May I call your Lordship's attention to what took place on the first day, on page 7, as I want to give your Lordship assistance as far as I can. You will see, immediately after question 123, on top of the left-hand column, I said this to the court, quote, 'The other question I desire to put,' and he goes on to talk about the questions he wanted to ask on the first day of the inquiry that we just looked at. And the Commissioner would go on to say, 'You see, I do not know what the question was, and I do not know what the answer was, and you do.' And Mr. Rose Innes would reply, 'No, I do not, my lord. I was not present.' And Lord Mersey says, 'I know you were not, but I suppose you have been told about the question.' And Mr. Rose Innes replies, 'Not a word, my lord. I am in a state of perfect innocence for once.' And what all this means goes back to Lord Mersey not allowing Mr. Rose Innes to ask the question that had something to do with the message sent to the Lusitania that Lord Mersey ruled to be kept secret. Lord Mersey figured that even though Mr. Rose Innes wasn't at that closed-door meeting where he made the ruling that the message had to be kept secret, he figured Mr. Rose Innes would have heard about everything from one source or another, and therefore would have the answer to his own question that he wanted to propose, that Lord Mersey blocked. But as we can see there, he tells Lord Mersey that he doesn't know anything about it, meaning the contents of the message sent to the Lusitania. The only thing Mr. Rose Innes knows about it is that Lord Mersey has ruled that its contents are not to be made public. And what the Commissioner says to Mr. Rose Innes next, I find to be rather astounding. On the next page, we see the Commissioner, Lord Mersey, reply, 'Well, you know what a desire for knowledge once led to. It led to an awful disaster from which we have never recovered. I think you had better leave it alone.' And Mr. Rose Innes replies, 'There are two things. There is the interests of my clients, and if your Lordship says I better leave it alone.' And Lord Mersey cuts him off again, saying, 'I think so. I do not know what it is, and not knowing what it is, I am in a position to say, I think you had better leave it alone.' And Mr. Rose Innes finally concedes, 'One appreciates your Lordship's advice on all occasions.' And I think this pretty much best sums up what Commissioner Lord Mersey is telling Mr. Rose Innes and the rest of the world to do. So what was the certain specific information and directions sent out by the Admiralty to the Lusitania on the morning of May 7th that Lord Mersey ruled had to be kept secret? Remember, the Life magazine article told us that Captain Turner was adamant that it was instructions to divert him to Queenstown, though he wouldn't specifically say that at the inquiry. As if that were true, with what was known publicly at the time, that would most certainly cause a lot of trouble and grief for the Admiralty. Now, I came across something very interesting in the logbook of the U-20's commander, Walter Schwager, which corroborates what Captain Turner allegedly said about being instructed to divert into Queenstown. In the National Archives, you'll find a translated copy of his logbook. And Captain Schwager writes that at 2:05 p.m., the steamer, the Lusitania, turned to starboard, headed for Queenstown, and thus made it possible to approach for a shot. So, was Captain Turner instructed to turn into Queenstown? It looks like we'll never actually get the answer to that, as when the public inquiry closed on June 18, 1915, we see here in this article from the Pittsburgh Press that papers were burned. It was understood that Captain Turner's testimony and instructions the Admiralty are said to have issued to the Lusitania's commander were destroyed. So how about that? That would mean that the only evidence of what the Admiralty's orders actually were are lying in a safe at the bottom of the ocean off the Irish coast. A safe that in 2015, if you remember from the Stanford magazine article, Greg Bemis had hoped to salvage and raise. And he certainly wasn't the first with those aspirations. A day after the Lusitania's sinking, on May the 8th, we see Navy Department officers saying that because of the shallow depths where the Lusitania sank, salvaging property from the wreckage shouldn't be difficult. And 4 months later, on September 11th, 1915, we see inventor Simon Lake at the beginning of his decades-long journey to get to the bottom of the Lusitania. Simon Lake, inventor of the type of submarine that bears his name, has evolved an apparatus that can recover the valuable cargo of the sunken Lusitania and other vessels destroyed by German submarines. 9 months later, on June 3rd, 1916, we see Simon Lake's salvage schemes to be used by a rich new corporation. Not beyond human possibility that the Lusitania's cargo may be brought to surface through mechanical devices perfected by pioneer of submarine invention and his associates. Now fast forward 16 years to November 23rd, 1931, and we see that Simon Lake is still at it. And he says, by the first of the year, if the British authorities give final sanction to a project now well underway, I hope to see the decks of the Cunarder Lusitania. And he also says, in the safe of the purser, which in a salvaging expedition we expect to be able to bring to the surface, there will undoubtedly be documents of vast importance. Perhaps including documents that the British and American governments would prefer to not see the light of day? Anyways, 3 more years later, on October 5th, 1934, we see Simon Lake's going to make another attempt. An attempt to salvage the Lusitania may be made by Simon Lake. The veteran inventor asserted his contract with the British government expires at the close of the year, but if the practicality of the 117-foot tube is proved, he plans to seek a renewal of the contract and construct a larger tube for salvaging the Lusitania, which of course never happened. And Simon Lake's attempts over the decades reminded me of Greg Bemis and all the battles he went through over the decades trying to do salvage dives on the Lusitania. And it seems that despite 100 years of attempts by some of the top experts who spent decades trying, that the powers that be, whatever they may be, have managed to batten down the hatches on the secrets that still lie with the Lusitania, only 300 feet below the surface. Something I've noticed is that there seems to be plenty of debate as to whether the Lusitania was used for depth charge practice or not by the British Navy. And there's a couple of pictures you can find on the internet of hedgehog mines that are alleged to be taken at the Lusitania's wreck site. And this is one of those pictures. And I did a little bit of digging and found out that this picture was taken by Owen McGarry, who we saw earlier in the CBS article we looked at. And remember, Owen McGarry's dived the site many a times. And he led the 2008 expedition that found the millions of rounds of 303s. And he was a good friend of Greg Bemis as well. So considering the source of the photo is Owen McGarry, I believe it to be genuine. But here's the catch. Instead of doing depth charge practices, I believe it's entirely possible that they were just trying to destroy the remainder of the ship. And I say that for a couple reasons. For one, technology was getting better, and it would only be a matter of time before a person would be able to just dive down there. So blowing her up would destroy any secrets that she may still be carrying. And also, this wouldn't be the first time we would hear talk of blowing up the Lusitania's remains. From the Gazette-Times out of Pittsburgh on May 10, 1915, so just 3 days after the sinking of the Lusitania, On page 2, under the headline, Hope is Abandoned for More Survivors, we see, it is believed by many that the Lusitania herself coffins hundreds of the dead, and tonight there is serious discussion whether an effort shall be made to blow up the hull in some way to release these bodies. She lies 40 fathoms below the surface, which makes it too far down for divers to work there. Explosives, however, can be placed on her, and this may be done. So really? You're going to blow up the hull to release the bodies? That sounds even more ridiculous than using the Lusitania for target practice. Now, let's fast forward a couple of decades to 1937. And again we see they're talking about blowing up the Lusitania. Salvage operations in the former Cunard liner Lusitania, which was torpedoed and sunk by a German submarine in 1915 with a loss of 1,198 lives, are expected to begin in April. Again, it is planned to break the ship underwater by explosives. So why did they want to use explosives this time? Because, in addition to its value as scrap metal, it is believed to contain valuable jewelry. So again, really? You're going to blow up the ship and then somehow think you're going to find jewelry? Notice that it says 2 obstacles hitherto have prevented the salvage of the Lusitania. And one of those obstacles was that they still couldn't dive to that 300-foot depth that the Lusitania wreck site lays at. And the other was that for the longest time, no one knew exactly where the site was. Not even Simon Lake, who we just had a good look at. But that changed in October of 1935, when Captain Henry B. Russell found the wreck. He actually first found the site in August of 1935, but due to a major problem with one of its boilers on his ship, he had to abandon the search, and then would come back in October to confirm it. So with the wreckage of the Lusitania having been found a year and a half earlier, what might have been going on that prompted them to want to blow up the ship again in 1937? Well, there was this really angry guy who was the leader of Germany who was about to blitzkrieg his way across Europe. And now that the location of the Lusitania was known, if the true nature of her cargo was discovered, that really angry and psychotic guy might get a whole lot angrier. Now let's dive into the lies and propaganda of the torpedoing of the Lusitania. In the evening papers of the day of the sinking, on May 7th, we see the news spreading far and wide that the Lusitania was torpedoed. What we don't see are any numbers in regards to how many torpedoes were fired, or how many struck the ship. And granted, this is only hours after the sinking of the Lusitania, and there's a lot of confusion going on in the first reports that were coming out, leaving the evening editions of the newspapers to have to run with the stories they got. And considering the main means of transatlantic communication at the time, some of those stories were quite wrong, as we can see in this May 7th headline, which is similar to some of the mistaken early reporting on the sinking of the Titanic. The day after the sinking, in the morning editions of newspapers all over the world, we now see there is, however, no doubt that 2 torpedoes were fired. And of course there can be no doubt that there was 2 torpedoes fired because there was 2 explosions, and the only way they were going to explain the second explosion was with the second torpedo, which, like we saw earlier in the New York Times, was repeated in newspaper after newspaper. And some newspapers were reporting that there were 4 torpedoes fired at the Lusitania. And here's an account from one of the survivors who worked for a Toronto, Canada newspaper, who says the Lusitania was hit with 2 torpedoes. A sharp lookout for submarines was kept aboard the Lusitania as she approached the Irish coast, according to Ernest Cowper, a Toronto newspaperman, who was among the survivors landed here. He declared that after the ship was torpedoed, there was no panic among the crew, but that they went about the work of getting passengers into the boats in a prompt and efficient manner. As we neared the coast of Ireland, said Mr. Cowper, we all joined in the lookout, for a possible attack by a submarine was the sole topic of conversation. I was chatting with a friend at the rail about 2 o'clock when suddenly I caught a glimpse of the conning tower of a submarine about 1,000 yards distant. I immediately called my friend's attention to it. Immediately we both saw the track of a torpedo, followed almost instantly by an explosion. Portions of splintered hull were sent flying into the air, and then another torpedo struck. The ship began to list starboard. Now, I don't think Ernest Cowper was lying when he said the Lusitania was hit with 2 torpedoes. He saw one torpedo coming in and hit the ship, and then there was a second explosion. And he, like some other survivors who saw only one torpedo coming in, just automatically thought that the second explosion must have been another torpedo. But there were indeed some people who lied about how many torpedoes they saw, and they were from among the members of the crew, as we'll see coming up. The next day, on May 9th, 1915, we see the British Embassy giving out an official statement. This statement says it is reported that she was struck by 2 torpedoes. The statement is a copy of a telegram received from Sir Edward Grey. And if you'll remember, Sir Edward Grey is the British Foreign Secretary who, on the morning the Lusitania was sunk, asked Colonel Edward House, "What will America do if the Germans sink an ocean liner with American passengers on board?" And from his official statement, it reads, "Ship sank from 15 to 25 minutes, and it is reported she was struck by 2 torpedoes." And from that point on, that becomes the official narrative, even though there were some very credible witnesses who might have suggested otherwise. Such is what we see the next day in the morning edition of Pittsburgh's Gazette-Times on May 10th. And if you'll notice, it's actually out of London, sent on May 9th, the same day that British Foreign Secretary Edward Grey announced that the Lusitania was hit by 2 torpedoes. Among the first survivors to arrive in London was Oliver P. Bernard. He had been in America for 6 months in connection with a scheme for cooperative opera. Mr. Bernard has had considerable experience as a practical sailor and was able to give a clear account of his experiences. He finished luncheon at 2:15 Friday and went straight to the Veranda Cafe, where he leaned on the starboard rail, looking forward. In a moment he saw something above the smooth surface of the sea, at a distance of from 150 to 200 yards from the ship. At first he thought it was a fish's tail, but he noticed the water seething a little around it, and the idea struck him that it might be a periscope. It was then forward of the Lusitania's bows. The realization of what it actually was hardly crystallized in his mind when he saw the torpedo start. He glanced at his wristwatch and he saw that it was exactly 22 minutes after 2. He watched the torpedo's frothy track until the very moment of impact. It seemed to be just trickling along, he said. It was hard to attempt to judge the pace of such a thing coming towards one, but it seemed to be traveling at about 5 knots an hour. It was fired just as we came level with the submarine and struck us between the second and third funnels, under the forward cabins, in the bridge. The impact was terrific. I could feel the ship reel as if struck by a huge hammer. It seemed to me the torpedo must have penetrated clean through. Then a terrific explosion inside blew right up through the 4 decks, throwing up a column of coal dust, water, and debris of all kinds. It reminded me on a large scale of the pictures showing mine explosions in the trenches at the front. I dashed into the cafe just in time, for down came a huge mass of water, breaking down the outside awning. Some supposed this was seawater, but that is impossible. It was undoubtedly the contents of the great water tanks taken up by the explosion. I am sure only one torpedo struck the Lusitania. And of course Oliver Bernard wasn't called upon to testify at the Lusitania inquiry. He was an architect and designer by trade, and on May 14th, the Illustrated London News asked him if he could do some drawings of the sinking, which they would then produce on their front page on May 15th. and some of the descriptions that Oliver Bernard added to the drawings are rather interesting. Especially this one, which says, "Explosion coming up through deck." And although Oliver Bernard's accounting of what happened that day wasn't used in the official narrative, history would go on to prove him correct, and there was only one torpedo. And I find it pretty interesting that on the same day that British Foreign Secretary Edward Grey stated the Lusitania was struck by 2 torpedoes, we also see survivor Oliver Bernard state that he was sure there was only 1 torpedo. And going back to Pittsburgh's Gazette Times, we also see on the same day out of London, the survivors do not agree as to whether the submarine fired 1 or 2 torpedoes. But yet the official statement from British Foreign Secretary Edward Grey doesn't say anything like that, does it? And despite the May 9th official statement from British Foreign Secretary Edward Grey saying that 2 torpedoes struck the Lusitania, or 1 torpedo from survivor Oliver Bernard or others, we see in the Boston Evening Transcript on May 10th that a survivor says 3 torpedoes hit the Lusitania. The statement that 3 torpedoes were fired at the Lusitania was made to the Fishguard correspondent of the Daily News on the authority of Reverend Mr. Gouvier of the Church of England's Canadian Railway Mission, who said the 3rd found its mark while the last boat was being lowered. When the Lusitania sank, Mr. Gouvier said a submarine rose to the surface and came within 300 yards of the scene. The crew stood solidly on the deck, he said, and surveyed their handiwork. I could distinguish the German flag, but it was impossible to see the number of the submarine, which disappeared after a few minutes. And you know, that's just a whole bunch of BS, made worse by the fact that Mr. Gouvier is a reverend. And the number of torpedoes that were fired at, or actually struck the Lusitania, would continue to be a field day for the press. The day after the sinking on May the 8th, the coroner in Kinsale, John Joseph Horgan, began an inquest, and the Lusitania's captain, William Turner, would give testimony. And 2 days later, on May 10th, a verdict was rendered. And as we can see from the Boston Evening Transcript on May 11th, that verdict was murder. And right below that we see possibly only 1 torpedo, according to Captain Turner, who also testified he had special instructions as to the voyage. During Captain Turner's testimony, the coroner asked him whether he had received a message concerning the sinking of a ship off Kinsale by a submarine. Captain Turner replied that he had not, and they're talking about the Earl of Latham that was sunk on May the 5th, 2 days before the Lusitania would be sunk right in that general area. And then the coroner, John Horgan, asks him, "Did you receive any special instructions as to the voyage?" And Captain Turner replies, "Yes, sir." "Are you at liberty to tell us what they were?" And Captain Turner replies, "No, sir." "Did you carry them out?" Captain Turner replies, "Yes, to the best of my ability." And then Coroner John Horgan says, "Tell us in your own words what happened after passing Fastnet." "The weather was clear," Captain Turner answered. "We were going at a speed of 18 knots. I was on the port side and heard Second Officer Hefford call out, 'Here's a torpedo.' I ran to the other side and saw clearly the wake of a torpedo. Smoke and steam came up between the last 2 funnels. There was a slight shock. Immediately after the first explosion, there was another report, but that may have possibly been internal." So how about that? Captain Turner says he clearly saw the wake of a torpedo, and that the second explosion might possibly have been internal. And you know, that kind of talk isn't going to sit very well with Churchill and the Admiralty. At any rate, the coroner's jury verdict was wholesale murder.
What was the verdict? The verdict was really a declaration. After finding the usual details about the deaths of the various people by drowning as the result of the sinking of the Lusitania, we added these words: "We find that this appalling crime was contrary to international law and the conventions of all civilized nations, and we therefore charge the officers of the submarine and the Emperor and government of Germany, under whose orders they acted, with the crime of willful wholesale murder before the tribunal of the civilized world.
And we can see, again from Eric Larson's Dead Wake, that the British Admiralty wanted to place the blame on Captain Turner, and they weren't too happy with the coroner inquest done by John Horgan. And on the same day we see the coroner jury results, May 11th, we also see this from Winston Churchill. The Admiralty had general knowledge of the German warning issued in America, Mr. Churchill declared. And from that knowledge and other information concerning submarine movements, it sent warnings to the Lusitania and directions as to its course. I think, however, it is not right to go into that matter in detail, as it is going to be a subject of inquiry, and it might appear that I was endeavoring to throw blame on the captain of the Lusitania in a matter of which will be a subject of full investigation. And notice he says other information concerning submarine movements. And of course, as we know now, that other information was coming from room 40. And he said they sent warnings to the Lusitania, but yet didn't tell him that a submarine had sunk 3 ships in the 2 days previously, right in the waters ahead of them, even though cities across North America were told by the morning of the 7th. And he says the Lusitania was sent directions as to its course. And I wonder if those are the directions that weren't allowed in the British inquiry under Lord Mersey. And speaking of Lord Mersey, continuing, Mr. Churchill said this investigation would be conducted by Lord Mersey, assisted by skilled assessors. And remember, this is mere days after the sinking, so we can see the fix is in already. And the next day, on May 12th, we can see that things are going pretty badly for Captain Turner. The hostility against Captain Turner personally is quite venomous, and the fact of his survival of the disaster is regarded locally as an offense. Criticism accusing him of mismanagement is frequent. So imagine that, and it would be a long couple of months before his name would be cleared in the British inquiry by Lord Mersey. Now remember, from Eric Larson's Dead Wake, we saw it was the same day, May 12th, that U-20 submarine captain Walter Schwager had resumed communications with his base, and Room 40 was listening to those messages. And we see on that same day, May 12th, that a third message was sent from Schwager that noted that he had sunk the Lusitania, quote, by means of 1 torpedo, end quote. So Churchill and a select few in the British Admiralty knew 5 days after the sinking that the Lusitania was sunk with only 1 torpedo. But of course that wouldn't do because there was 2 explosions. So how were they going to explain the second explosion? And of course the answer was to lie and cover that up and stick to the story that the Lusitania was struck by 2 torpedoes. On May 15th, we see a member of the crew telling the newspapers that 2 torpedoes struck the Lusitania. And by May 18th, 6 days after Churchill and the British Admiralty already knew that the Lusitania was struck by only 1 torpedo because Room 40 had intercepted Captain Schwager's messages, we would see in the newspapers that the German official statement was that there was only 1 torpedo fired, and the second explosion was ammunition. And on the same day, May 18th, in the Harrisburg Star-Independent, we see Germany citing the report from Captain Schwager that only 1 torpedo was fired. And again, that's the same report that Room 40 intercepted on May the 12th. Now let's take a little sidestep and hop across the pond and see a little bit of what was going on in the United States between the sinking of the Lusitania on May 7th and the beginning of the British inquiry on June 15th. And keep in mind that none of the information we're going to see here was made available to the public until 1939. Like this letter from the Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, Andrew J. Peters, to the then Counselor of the United States State Department, Robert Lansing, sent on May 8, 1915, so the day after the sinking. Dear Mr. Lansing, in response to Mr. Wolsey's request on the telephone this morning that I obtain certain information from the collector in New York in regard to the Cunard liner Lusitania, I beg to report as follows. Whether she had any contraband or ammunition on board at the time she sailed from New York. Practically all of her cargo was contraband of some kind. And a few weeks later, we see Secretary of State William Bryan send a letter to President Wilson. Sent in the evening of June 3, 1915, Secretary of State Bryan writes, "My dear Mr. President, I am sending you the memorandum prepared by Mr. Lansing." And further down he writes, "It seems to me that the question of ammunition is the most serious one raised, and I do not share Mr. Lansing's view that we can ignore entirely the question raised as to whether our law was violated. Even if we say that the enforcement of our laws must be entrusted to our own officials and not to commanders of submarines of belligerents, still we must consider the moral effect of a position which would make us seem to acquiesce in the carrying of American citizens with ammunition in violation of law." And we would see 6 days later on June 9, 1915, Secretary of State Bryan quits over his disagreements with President Wilson. And he publicly stated that there was two main reasons of disagreement between him and President Wilson that led to him quitting. And the first was Bryan's suggestion of an investigation by an international commission, and the second as to warning Americans against traveling on belligerent vessels or with cargoes of ammunition. So that's pretty telling, isn't it? The Secretary of State wants to have an international commission investigate the sinking, and wants it to be mandatory that Americans are warned at least against traveling on belligerent ships that might be carrying ammunition. And President Wilson is against this. And 6 days later, on June 15, 1915, we see a letter from the interim Secretary of State, Robert Lansing, to President Wilson. And June 15th also happens to be the beginning of the British inquiry as well. And Robert Lansing writes, "Dear Mr. President, I enclose a memorandum which the British ambassador handed me yesterday, requesting copies of sworn declarations of the United States Customs or other officers who examined the Lusitania prior to her departure from New York for use of the British government in connection with the Lusitania inquiry. I am informed by the Treasury Department that the reports of the collector at New York are in your hands." And as we learned earlier, President Wilson would eventually bury everything in the Treasury Department. So the British are asking for reports from the Collector of Customs in New York about their examination of the Lusitania so they can use it in the British inquiry. And Robert Lansing here is asking President Wilson what he should send. And he included in his letter to President Wilson the original memorandum from the British ambassador who was making the requests. And we see the next day, on June 16, 1915, President Wilson writes back, "My dear Mr. Secretary, I think that perhaps it would not be wise to send the collector's report concerning the Lusitania to Great Britain for the use of the Court of Inquiry, and that it would be better to ask the Treasury Department to supply the British ambassador with sworn statements of the customs officers covering the particular points mentioned by him in his memorandum." And he adds, "in haste." And I find it pretty interesting and apparent that President Wilson's attitude towards this is one of concealment and cherry-picking which information is allowed to go out to the public, in this case through the British inquiry. Which began on June 15, 1915. And on the first day, the Lusitania's captain, William Turner, would take the stand. And the Attorney General, Edward Carson, would ask him, "Will you tell his lordship and the assessors in your own way what happened?" And Captain Turner replies, "The officer called out, 'There was a torpedo coming, sir,' and I went across to the starboard side and saw the wake, and there was immediately an explosion, and the ship took a heavy list." And Edward Carson asks him, "Did you say that you yourself saw the wake of the torpedo?" And Captain Turner replies, "I saw a streak like the wake of a torpedo." And we see the Attorney General, Edward Carson, ask, "Did you notice any other concussion that would have led you to believe there was a second torpedo?" To which Captain Turner replies, "One immediately after the first." And there's no talk of an internal explosion whatsoever. And actually, this is pretty much all they ask Captain Turner about in regards to the torpedoing of the Lusitania. The next question Edward Carson goes into is about the lifeboats. The next day on June 16th, we see a member of the crew, Leslie Morton, being questioned by the Solicitor General, Frederick E. Smith. And he asks, "Were you an able seaman on the Lusitania?" To which Morton replies, "Yes. And I think you were the extra lookout on the forecastle head, starboard side, during the 2 to 4 watch on Friday the 7th of May. And Morton responds, "Yes." And Morton was the lookout who was the first to see the torpedo and alert the bridge. We see Frederick E. Smith ask him, "Tell us what happened after that." And Leslie Morton says, "At 10 minutes past 2 I looked at my watch, and putting it into my pocket I glanced around the starboard side, and, as roughly as I could judge, I saw a big burst of foam about 500 yards away, 4 points on the starboard bow. Immediately after, I saw a thin streak of foam making for the ship at a rapid speed, and then I saw another streak of foam going parallel with the first one and a little behind it." And Frederick Smith asks, "Are you quite clear in your recollection that you saw 2 of these streaks of foam?" To which Leslie Morton replies, "Absolutely." And of course now with hindsight, we know he's full of shit. The next day, on June 17th, we see another member of the crew, Frederick O'Neill, being questioned by a Mr. Dunlop, who was a lawyer for the Board of Trade. And he asks, "Were you an able seaman and lamp trimmer on the Lusitania?" And Frederick O'Neill replies, "Yes." And Mr. Dunlop asks, "When you got up on deck, did you notice anything in the water?" And Frederick O'Neill says, "Yes, I saw what appeared to me to be a torpedo that had missed the ship, going away from the starboard quarter." And then he was asked, "What did you see in the water that led you to form that opinion?" And Frederick O'Neill says, "Well, the wash. I have seen torpedoes work, and it was a torpedo that I saw going away from the ship. It just missed her by a few feet." And Mr. Dunlop says, "And passed her under the stern?" To which Frederick O'Neill replies, "Yes." And then Mr. Dunlop asks him, "Have you any doubt at all that what you saw was a torpedo?" And Frederick O'Neill replies, "None whatever." And considering that only one torpedo was fired and didn't miss the ship, we can see that Frederick O'Neill's testimony is bullshit as well. On the same day, June 17th, we see another crew member, Joseph Casey, giving testimony. And he was a fireman on the Lusitania. And he was being questioned by Solicitor General Frederick Smith, who asked, "What happened?" And Joseph Casey says, "There was another shipmate of mine and me looking at a passenger fixing a trunk up, and this shipmate says to me, 'Joe, what's that?' I immediately looked to the forward end on the starboard side, and I saw 2 white streaks approaching the ship. One seemed to be traveling quicker than the other." And Frederick Smith asks him, "Have you any doubt from your experience that there were 2 torpedoes you saw at this time?" And Joseph Casey answers, "No doubt at all, because there were 2 streaks." So again, we see another crew member just completely bullshitting about how many torpedoes there were. And also on June 17th, we see the Attorney General, Edward Carson, state, "There is a letter which I should like to read from the Collector of the Treasury Department of the United States Customs of the Port of New York." And if you remember from earlier, the Collector of Customs of the Port of New York was Dudley F. Malone. And this is part of the material that President Wilson and Robert Lansing were talking about. And Malone's statement to the British Inquiry reads, "In reply to this inquiry, I have to state all the articles specified in the manifest of the Lusitania are permitted to be shipped on a passenger liner under the laws of the United States." So live fuses were permitted to be shipped on passenger liners under U.S. law?
Artillery fuses, and we now know that when they were coming up from the bottom, they were in fact live.
There's many aspects of the British inquiry into the Lusitania that are quite astounding. Like the issue of the torpedoes, I find the subject of the Lusitania's lifebelts to be simply incredible. When you go through the various testimonies of the survivors, it becomes quite clear there was no lifebelts on the decks. Miss Mabel Kate Leroyd, when we reached the top deck, we had come without our lifebelts and returned for them. In answer to another question, she mentions a few women calling and asking for lifebelts. The Reverend Mr. Clark, who says, "I went down to my cabin on the D-deck, and you got, I think, a lifebelt?" he's asked. And he responds that it wasn't a lifebelt, but it was a sort of jacket. Mr. John Freeman, who's asked, "Did you have any difficulty in finding your lifebelt?" And he responds, "I got my lifebelt out of a first-class cabin myself, but I had to go into several cabins down below on E deck before I found them because it was dark. Theodore Diamandis, who was asked, were any of the stewards giving lifebelts out to the passengers? To which Theodore Diamandis responds, I did not see them. Mr. John Jones, who's asked, do you know whether on the top deck there was a reserve of lifebelts? And he responds, I did not see them. A few questions later he's asked, with regard to the lifebelts, whereabouts had you seen any lifebelts on the deck prior to the ship being struck? And he says, on this voyage I had not seen any. And they go on some more about the lifebelts, and then the Commissioner, Lord Mercy, jumps in saying, I'm not going to listen to the evidence of people who say they did not see them. I did not see them, and no doubt many people did not see them. Then there's this exchange between Mr. Francis Jenkins, Mr. Rose Innes, and the Commissioner. With reference to lifebelts, did you search about the deck for lifebelts? Not on that particular day, but I had previously observed that no lifebelts were on the deck at all. I had spoken about it to several friends on board. Where were the lifebelts kept as far as you saw? In the cabins, there was one in my cabin on top of the wardrobe. It particularly struck my attention that no lifebelts were on the deck under such critical conditions. Then Lord Mercy chimes in, what do you think it became of them since the vessel left Liverpool? I'm not aware. I saw none on the deck. I saw lifebuoys. But do you mean to swear they were not there? I cannot swear unless they were covered up. I saw none. Up to the time of the ship being struck by the torpedo, you had been struck by their absence? I had been. And mentioned it? It struck me. And then Lord Mercy chimes in again saying, what he says is that he did not see them. That I can quite believe. But that they were not there, I do not believe. The surveyor says they were there. They did not fly away. And Mr. Rose Innes says, your lordship has had evidence that they were on board before starting. What do you suggest became of them? I can make no suggestion whatever, except to call the evidence and ask your lordship to draw your own inference. And then Lord Mercy says, do you mean they were stolen? They could not have been eaten. What became of them? They were there when the ship left Liverpool, and the carpenter says they were not taken off when the ship was at New York. And the survivor's testimony carries on. Miss Evelyn Wilde, who's asked, now just one more question. Had you looked about to see if you could find any lifebelts? We had no lifebelts until we were in the lifeboat, and then one of the passengers handed me one, but my sister had none. Were you the only one in the boat that had a lifebelt? Yes. Had you seen any about on the deck? No, I had not. Mr. Robert Timmis, who had this exchange with the Commissioner, Lord Mercy, who says, I do not think we want the conversation with the lady. Tell us what took place. I then went to my room on A deck and put my belt on. So Robert Timmis had to go to his room to get a belt as well. And he continues on with what happened to him, and then Lord Mercy cuts in again saying, does it matter about their bringing a woman to you? And Robert Timmis replies, no, I do not think it does. And Lord Mercy says, then do not tell us about it. And Robert Timmis says, all right, except that she had not a lifebelt, my lord. To which Lord Mercy responds, cannot you get to the end of this story? And clearly Lord Mercy is pretty frustrated with the issue of the lifebelts. And the testimony still goes on. Mr. David Thomas. So I thought I would make another try and get down to my cabin, and I succeeded in getting a belt. And then you went up to A deck again? Yes. So Mr. David Thomas, like so many others, had to go back down to their cabins to get a lifebelt. Mr. Robert Carnes. Before you got into the lifeboat, had you made a search about the decks for lifebelts? I had. Did you find any? Not a single one. Mr. Robertson. After I came up from getting my lifebelt, meaning he had to go to his room to get a lifebelt, which was also the case with survivor Oliver Bernard. Then there's the accounts of what happened with Alfred Vanderbilt, who couldn't swim, and he gave up his lifebelt to a girl and helped her put it on, and then went off looking for another one. But unfortunately, this was right before the final plunge of the Lusitania. And despite all that testimony given by so many witnesses, when the British inquiry was over and Lord Mercy handed down his rulings, we can see what he says about the Lusitania's life-saving appliances, stating, the ship was provided with 2,325 life jackets, and that figure would include lifebelts. And he goes on to state, all these were conveniently distributed on board. which as we've seen is a bunch of BS. There was nothing convenient about them. And now going back to the issue of the torpedoing of the Lusitania, remember the Guardian article that we looked at earlier that mentioned French survivor Joseph Marichal, who claimed ammunition triggered a second explosion and Lord Mersey dismissed him. He gave his testimony on July 1st, 1915, and started out being questioned by the Solicitor General Frederick E. Smith. And we can see he says, the second explosion might have been due primarily to the explosion of a torpedo, but not to a torpedo alone. The nature of the explosion was similar to the rattling of a machine gun for a short period. And Frederick Smith asks him, do you suggest that a Maxim gun was discharged on the ship? And Joseph Marichal responds, no, my lord. I suggest that the explosion of the torpedo caused the subsequent explosion of some ammunition, and I have special experience of explosives. And he goes on to say that he served in the French military for 5 years. The next couple of pages of his testimony deals with how he and his family were treated by officials after the sinking, and ultimately he would end up arguing with Lord Mersey, finishing off saying, if you give a dog a black name, you drown him. You have tried to do so with all the other witnesses. It is shameful the way you have treated witnesses here. And Lord Mersey says, do you suggest that I have not treated you properly? Do not be cross with me. To which Joseph Marichal responds again, I say it is shameful the way the witnesses have been treated here, which I would tend to agree with him. And on the same day, July 1st, we would see his accounting of the second explosion being caused by the cargo appearing in the newspapers. But in the inquiry's final report issued July 17th, Lord Mersey would say this about the torpedoing of the Lusitania. One of the crew, Leslie Ann Morton, who deserves a special word of commendation. He was the first to observe the approach of the 2 torpedoes. So how about that? Leslie Morton deserves a special word of commendation for lying. And how about this? He saw the crew distributing life belts to the passengers. Really? Because that's the only account I've come across that says as much. And it's also interesting that Lord Mersey would take the word of an 18-year-old who said he absolutely saw the streak of 2 torpedoes, which we now know was a lie, over the word of another witness, Joseph Marichal, who said there was only 1 torpedo, and who had been in the military for 5 years. And in his ruling under the section titled, The Torpedoing of the Ship, he writes that the captain, Captain Turner, looked to starboard and then saw a streak of foam in the wake of a torpedo, traveling towards his ship. Immediately afterwards, the Lusitania was struck on the starboard side. A second torpedo was fired immediately afterwards, which also struck the ship. The 2 torpedoes struck the ship almost simultaneously, and that is his official ruling. And notice he attributes the captain as seeing a streak of foam in the wake of a torpedo, and then says a second torpedo was fired and the 2 torpedoes struck the ship almost simultaneously. But anything to do with the second torpedo didn't come from the captain at all, but rather members of the crew who were lying about it, as we saw, such as Leslie Morton. And remember Captain Turner's testimony at the coroner's inquest a month earlier, where he stated that he clearly saw the wake of a torpedo, and immediately after the first explosion, there was another report, but that may have possibly been internal. But the way Lord Mersey words his ruling, without saying it, comes across like the captain confirmed there was 2 torpedoes, which was not the case. And in the same section of his ruling, we see Lord Mersey state the portholes were also closed, which again goes against what the witnesses were saying. And it's a very important point, as there were hundreds of them running along each side of the decks of the Lusitania. On June 16th, the second day of the public hearings, we see Mrs. Mabel Kate Learoyd again, and her last name is one word, Learoyd, L-E-A-R-O-Y-D. And her and her husband Charles Alfred Learoyd were traveling first class, and their room, D57, was right beside the entrance to the first class dining room, which was on D deck. And Mabel Learoyd testified that when they went back to the room to get their life belts, she saw water streaming into the dining room. She described it as sort of a jet of water coming down, and concluded it was coming through a porthole. Unfortunately, her husband, Charles Alfred Learoyd, went down with the ship. Now fast forward a couple of weeks to July 1st, and we see the Commissioner Lord Mersey reciting the testimony of Mabel Learoyd, and he states, I think this lady was wrong in supposing that the water came from the portholes. Going back to June 17th, the third day of the inquiry, we can see in the testimony of Mr. Francis Jenkins again that when he was in the water, he saw an open porthole, and he clutched it, but he couldn't hold on. And again, fast forward to July 1st, in those same conversations with Lord Mercy, who's now talking about Francis Jenkins' testimony, and he says there's evidence of some man who was in the water who says he tried to catch hold of an open port, but I am very strongly of opinion that he did not. And a little bit later on in those conversations, we see a Mr. Cotter. Not that Mr. Cotter, but a Mr. Cotter who was representing some members of the crew. And he states to Lord Mercy, I am suggesting now that the majority of those ports were open when she was struck. And Lord Mercy responds, that is not my view at present. I may be wrong. And Mr. Cotter says, I suggest that if 60 ports were open, and those ports were 15 to 18 inches in diameter, to which Lord Mercy cuts in saying, I quite understand if those ports were open, and the ship took a list to the side on which they were open. It would be a vital thing indeed. And a little bit later they would have this exchange, with Mr. Cotter talking about witnesses who saw open portholes. And he says, the Board of Trade have statements of witnesses to this effect, but they were never called, and I was expecting they would be called. And Lord Mercy responds, I cannot control the Board of Trade, you know, as to what evidence they call. It is their duty to see that the court is properly furnished with the evidence, and I must rely on their counsel to do it. And Mr. Cotter says, I am raising the point now, my lord, that the witnesses have told the Board of Trade what I say. And Lord Mercy replies, I cannot help it. Is there anything else? And that's it. He doesn't want to hear any more of it, and they move on to another subject. But how about that? The Board of Trade had statements by other witnesses who also said the portholes were open, and they never called on them to give their testimony. And Lord Mercy seems perfectly fine with that. Charles E. Laureate, who was traveling first class in room B5, said he saw portholes open up near his room. And he also says that he went down to lunch at 1 o'clock and finished shortly before 2, which is about 10 minutes before the torpedo would strike. And he writes, the portholes along both sides of the dining saloon were open. And this would be the same first-class dining room that Mabel Leroyd was talking about. And remember, the Commissioner, Lord Mercy, said, I think this lady was wrong in supposing that the water came from the portholes. But as you can see, it looks like she was right. Charles Laureate also goes on to write, just before the steamer sank, she seemed to right herself and go down on quite an even keel. She settled by the stern. And that matches the testimony given by James Baker, who said the same thing, as well as descriptions by other passengers, including Oliver P. Bernard, who submitted drawings to the newspapers in the manner in which the ship sank. And Charles Laureate goes on to write that that is another reason that convinces me that if her portholes had been closed, she might have stayed afloat after her bow struck the bottom. And that makes sense, because the Lusitania was 787 feet long, in waters that were only 300 feet deep. And if water was only pouring in through the front half of the ship through the holes caused by the torpedo in the second explosion, then the Lusitania would have likely went down bow first, much like the Titanic did. And as Charles Laureate stated, her bow would have hit the bottom with the stern sticking up out of the water. But that's not how the Lusitania went down. Instead, she went down on a slight angle, tilting to the starboard side, as if water was filling up all her lower decks, front and back, until the last of her funnels and masts went under almost simultaneously. We can see Charles Laureate takes exception to Lord Mercy's ruling, writing, the court finds that the portholes were closed. On what and on whose evidence? And I completely agree with him on that. Captain Turner never testified about giving orders to have any portholes closed. There was one passenger who said he saw some portholes on the E-deck that were closed, and there were a couple of members of the crew who testified that Staff Captain Anderson, who went down with the ship, allegedly was going down to give orders to close the portholes at some point in the morning, but whether they were actually closed or not was not confirmed. And considering the other witnesses who said they saw open portholes, witnesses that corroborate each other at that, and that the Board of Trade blocked other witnesses from testifying to the same thing, and Lord Mercy seemed fine with that, as well as the manner of the way the ship sank, I agree with Mr. Cotter's assessment that the majority of those ports were open. We can also get a glimpse of what the Lusitania did concerning her portholes on previous voyages. And don't forget, the Lusitania was a target right from the beginning of the war. And we can see on one of her voyages in February of 1915, 3 months before her sinking, one of the precautions taken was that the Lusitania's portholes were curtained each night. Not closed, curtained. At any rate, I could go on and on about the British inquiry into the sinking of the Lusitania, but the bottom line is that it was a sham and a cover-up, and it was also a complete deflection of any and all responsibility of any and all aspects of the sinking, directed solely onto Germany. And also, Lord Mersey's final rulings, released on July 17th, would, in essence, make the survivors of the Lusitania victims yet again, this time of injustice, something that the survivors and their families and victims' families knew. As we can see in the newspapers the next day following Lord Mersey's ruling, anger aroused by Lusitania verdict, exoneration of captain and crew causes Americans to become indignant. And as we saw, Lord Mersey ruled that it was torpedoes, plural, that caused the Lusitania to go down. And in the opinion of the court, the act was done not merely with the intention of sinking the ship, but also with the intention of destroying the lives of the people on board, which is simply not true, and we'll get into the intentions and the legalities of it shortly. But we can see here, the report was a distinct disappointment to the American survivors, who expressed indignant surprise at the portion which exonerated Captain Turner and the Cunard Line from all blame, and commended the discipline of the crew. Before the reading began, Major Pearl, who has followed the whole case closely, expressed the opinion that the decision would sharply condemn the officers of the ship and of the Cunard Line for negligence. But of course that didn't happen. And instead we saw praise for members of the crew like Leslie Morton, who lied about how many torpedoes he saw, while at the same time disparaging the testimony of people like Joseph Mareschal, with Lord Mersey saying, "I do not believe this gentleman. His demeanor was very unsatisfactory and there was no confirmation of his story." It may be worth noting that Leith, the Marconi operator, who was in the second-class dining room, speaks of but one explosion. In my opinion, there was no explosion of any part of the cargo. Dwelling on the instructions to Captain Turner, Lord Mersey said, "It was made abundantly plain to me that the Admiralty had devoted most anxious care and thought to questions arising out of the submarine peril, and that they had diligently collected all available information likely to affect the voyage of the Lusitania. I do not know who the officials are to whom these duties were entrusted, but they deserve the highest praise. Captain Turner was fully advised as to the means which, in the view of the Admiralty, were best calculated to avert the peril he was likely to encounter." Are you kidding me? They let the Lusitania sail right into the waiting jaws of a submarine that had sunk 3 ships in the 2 days previous. And these guys deserve the highest praise? Unbelievable, yet there it is. And as we saw, over in New York, 3 years later, there was the lawsuit against the Cunard Company being run by Judge Julius Mayer. And during the making of this video, I did manage to track down a copy of his ruling from 1918. And it can be found in the International Conciliation, published in November of 1918. And we can see the trial went from April 17th to May 6th, 1918, with Judge Mayer's rulings to dismiss the lawsuits coming on August 23rd, 1918. Here's his ruling that states it was 125 shrapnel cases, as opposed to the 1,250 cases listed on the manifest as we saw earlier. Here he states in his ruling, as there were no explosives on board, it is difficult to account for the second explosion except on the theory that it was caused by a second torpedo. Whether the number of torpedoes was 1 or 2 is relevant, in this case, only upon the question of what effect, if any, open ports had in accelerating the sinking of the ship. And pretty much Judge Mayer would essentially just end up parroting the British inquiry conclusions, even quoting Lord Mersey saying, "The whole blame for the cruel destruction of life in this catastrophe must rest solely with those who plotted and with those who committed the crime." And Judge Mayer goes on to say, "But while in this lawsuit there may be no recovery, it is not to be doubted that the United States, of America and her allies will well remember the rights of those affected by the sinking of the Lusitania, and, when the time shall come, will see to it that reparation shall be made for one of the most indefensible acts of modern times. The petition is granted and the claims dismissed without costs. Julius M. Mayer, District Judge, August 23, 1918. Adding his name to a long list of officials on both sides of the pond that were involved in the cover-up and deflection of the truth and facts of the sinking of the Lusitania. And check out this little piece of propaganda also released in the summer of 1918 in the theaters on Universal's weekly newsreel. It's a cartoon, considered to be the first documentary cartoon made. It's interspersed with written information, and it's about 12 minutes long. But I've cut most of it down, and let's have a look at what some of it says. So as I say, they've inserted these slides of information in here and there for the viewers to read. And just to comment, the animation itself is rather impressive. But here we go with the two torpedo lies, and notice they identify the wrong submarine as well. Germany, once a great and powerful nation, had done a dastardly deed in a dastardly way. While the lifeboats were being lowered, a second torpedo crashed into the engine rooms. This was the death blow. And that is a bunch of bullshit. You can easily find the full-length version of this propaganda piece on YouTube, and you'll notice they didn't mention a word about the Lusitania also being loaded with war munitions. That's what was playing in the theaters in a continued recruitment/war bond drive as the war continued raging on in 1918. And remember, it was way back in May of 1915 when Winston Churchill and certain members of the British Admiralty and members of Room 40 already knew that the U-20 had fired only one torpedo. But of course they kept that knowledge completely top secret and hidden, keeping the two torpedo lie thriving and going on. Fast forward a couple of years to 1920, and we see Captain Schwager's logbook being leaked to the newspapers. And in it, the sinking of the Lusitania is described. And the public would learn that it was only one torpedo that sunk the Lusitania. And I won't read it all, but I'll highlight some of the points, and you can pause and read it at your leisure. And the story was put out by American reporter Frank Mason, a staff correspondent of the International News Service. And you'll see why in a minute why I say it was leaked to the newspapers. And here we can see German submarine captain Walter Schwager writes about what kind of torpedo was used and talks of a second explosion. He also mentions that he thought about firing a second torpedo, but decided against it. Here we can see the reporter Frank Mason saying, "I am not at liberty to explain how I secured possession of these important papers from the Naval Archives for 36 hours to enable them to be photographed." And that's what I mean about Captain Schwager's log being leaked to the newspapers. This wasn't a scheduled release. And here Frank Mason writes about the second explosion, saying, "Probably one of the most valuable revelations contained in the log is its indication that the second mysterious explosion came from within the Lusitania itself. Schwager did not attempt to define what actually caused this, but suggested, quote, boiler, coal, or powder." So of course the next day, over in Washington, D.C., claims that Captain Schwager's log were faked started appearing. Naturally, because you can't have the public knowing the truth that only one torpedo was fired at the Lusitania, because then the second explosion would need an explanation. And I notice here in this article it says, in some quarters, which is the equivalent of today's unnamed sources, so right away the bullshit detector should be going off. But they say, in some quarters, the theory was put forward that the U-boat commander recognized the Lusitania and fired, expecting her to remain afloat for hours. And that's the only part of their bullshit story that I find to be true. And they go on to say that he changed his log because he was scared that America might join the war, which sounds pretty ridiculous, really. But I do believe that Captain Schwager expected that the Lusitania would stay afloat for a couple hours after the torpedo hit, because being hit with only one torpedo, and all things being equal and nothing else involved, it wouldn't have caused enough damage to sink the Lusitania the way it went down. Fast forward now to 1923, and we see the Right Honorable Winston Churchill publish a series of books titled The World Crisis. And here's where we can see why I say Winston Churchill is a lying bullshitter. Because about the Lusitania, he writes, in spite of these warnings and instructions, for which the Admiralty Trade Division deserve credit, and he goes on to basically blame Captain Turner, and of course never mentions a thing about the secret instructions that have never been revealed to this day. And never mind the instructions, the Admiralty Trade Division deserves credit for the warnings? That's a joke. Why didn't they warn the Lusitania that a German submarine had sunk 3 ships in the 2 days previous in waters that the Lusitania was about to sail through? Which is something that newspapers across the United States already knew about and printed in their morning editions on May 7th, the day of the sinking. Deserve credit, my ass. And right below that, Churchill writes, 2 torpedoes were fired. The first striking her amidships with a tremendous explosion, and the second a few minutes later striking her aft, which is complete bullshit. And don't forget that Churchill's Room 40 had intercepted the U-20's transmissions, and Churchill and a select few from his inner circle knew on May 12, 1915, that the U-20 had only fired 1 torpedo at the Lusitania. But here he is in 1923, still pushing the 2 torpedo lie. And notice he says the second torpedo struck a few minutes later, striking her aft, meaning the back of the ship. And that's all wrong, of course, and while nobody knows the exact amount of time between the torpedo hit and the second explosion, survivors' accounts place the time frame from anywhere between 12 to 30 seconds, and most certainly not taking a matter of a few minutes. And I'm pretty sure he writes about the torpedo striking her aft as a way of deflecting attention to the fact that the second explosion was actually in the bow of the ship, or the front of the ship, where all the ammunition and war supplies were stored. At any rate, like I say, the so-called Honorable Winston Churchill is actually a lying piece of shit. And as we can see, those lies would continue on for decades to come. But it is refreshing to see that the New York Times, 100 years after their story that the Lusitania was twice torpedoed off the Irish coast, would issue a correction to their story, saying in fact the German U-boat had fired only 1 torpedo. So good for them, finally. Now let's have a look at some of the legalities involved in all of this. And in the decades leading up to World War I, there were a number of conferences, declarations, conventions establishing international law, signed onto by all the leading civilized nations of the world. But because of the timing of it, submarine warfare was not a subject of these treaties. And when it comes to the Lusitania, we mostly hear about the rules stated in the 1909 Declaration of London. And here we can see, at the outbreak of World War I, in the 1909 Declaration of London, materials and items for trade between countries during wartime were put into 3 categories. Absolute contraband, which would be war materials, conditional contraband, which could either have military or civilian use, and then a free list of items like foodstuffs and other non-military materials. The Germans and their Austro-Hungarian ally agreed to continue to abide by the declaration, provided Britain and her allies did likewise. But Britain had no intention of abiding by the treaty ironically titled the Declaration of London. And this can easily be seen as before the war even began, Britain was already arming her merchant fleet with hidden guns. Looking into the Declaration Treaty, Chapter 8, Resistance to Search, Article 63, it says, forcible resistance to the legitimate exercise of the right of stoppage, search, and capture involves in all cases the condemnation of the vessel. The cargo was liable to the same treatment as the cargo of an enemy vessel. Goods belonging to the master or owner of the vessel are treated as enemy goods. So as we can see, Britain, by almost arming her entire merchant marine fleet with guns, and having them hidden so they could lure in any unsuspecting enemy ships or subs, was in violation of the laws of the time from the start of the war. And not only just arming their ships, but Churchill issued further orders that large ships should not stop for U-boats, but should instead ram them, which is of course also a violation of the international laws and treaties at the time. And further, it says the Germans discovered this unpleasant development by February 1915. And actually, Germany would discover it a lot earlier than that, as we'll see. But one of the things I discovered during my research was this little tidbit from Wikipedia, which on their page on the U-29 states, U-29 was sunk after being rammed by HMS Dreadnought, which I agree with, as papers at the time were reporting that the U-29 was sunk. But then it says that the U-29 was the only submarine known to have been sunk in this way. And of course I have to totally disagree with that. And here's a good reason why you shouldn't just automatically believe everything you read on Wikipedia, or for that matter just automatically believing everything you hear and see from modern outlets. And it's also why I try to put as much original source material that's actually from the era into my videos, so that way you can see the documentation yourself and know what was going on at the time. I find that if you research deeply enough into any given subject, the truth of things begins to shine through. And as for U-29 being the only submarine known to be sunk by means of ramming, let's have a look. Just 3 months into the war, in October of 1914, a British destroyer, the HMS Badger, rammed and sunk a German submarine. About a month after that, in November of 1914, the HMS Gary rammed and sunk a German submarine. Skip forward a little bit to March of 1915, and we see the SS Thordis, a merchant ship, ram and sink a German submarine. A couple of days later, on March 5th of 1915, we would see the SS Alston ram and sink a German submarine. And they know, this makes the second German submarine sunk by a merchant ship. A few days after that, the HMS Ariel would ram and sink a German submarine, and they originally thought that it was the U-20 that was sunk, but instead it was the U-12. About a week after that was when the U-29 was rammed and sunk by the HMS Dreadnought, that Wikipedia thinks is the only submarine that was sunk by ramming. Towards the end of March, we would see the steamship, the SS Lizzie, ram and sink a German submarine. A couple days after that, we would see the steamship SS Brussels also ram and sink a German submarine. Next up, we see in the newspapers on May 14th, 1915, a week after the Lusitania went down, that the steamship SS Carnage succeeded in ramming and sinking a German submarine. A year later, on May 8th, 1916, we see the British liner Clan McFadden rammed and sunk a submarine. A year after that, with the United States now in the war, we see in June of 1917, an American liner rammed and sunk a German submarine. And notice at the bottom they say that the name of the liner was being withheld at the request of the Navy Department, but it was printed in other papers. And here's one of those other papers. And the name of the American liner that rammed the German submarine was the SS Kronland. 2 weeks after that, at the end of June 1917, a German submarine was rammed and sunk by an American destroyer. And they note below, this is the first German submarine American destroyers have destroyed. Fast forward to the end of September 1917, and we see a Canadian troop ship encountered a submarine and rammed it. Now, are you really going to trust everything you read on Wikipedia? I don't know who's doing the research, and while they do indeed have a lot of correct information, as we can see, sometimes they don't. There were plenty of German submarines that were sunk in World War I by being rammed by all kinds of different ships, including, as we've seen, destroyers, dreadnoughts, troop ships, merchant ships, and even passenger liners. And when it came to the international laws of the time, the liners and the merchant ships that did this were in violation of those laws. Another way Britain was in violation of the laws also began very early in the war, in the manner in which they enforced their blockade of Germany, which included seizing every incoming ship, including the ones carrying food. We also see in the newspapers on the same day, September 11th, 1914, that the entire North Sea may be blockaded by Great Britain. And by November 3rd, 1914, we would see that the day before, Britain did exactly that. And it wouldn't take the United States too long to enter into things, as by late December 1914, we see President Wilson declaring that large damages eventually would have to be paid by England for unlawful detention of American cargoes. Secretary of State William Bryan, 2 days earlier, had sent a telegram of protest to the U.S. Ambassador to Britain, Walter Page, to pass along to the British Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs, Sir Edward Grey. And if you'll remember, he was the one who was asking Colonel Edward House what the United States would do if Germany sunk an ocean liner with American passengers on board. A few hours before, a German submarine sunk the Lusitania. Anyways, the article would go on to say, the President coupled a confirmation of this morning's publication of the sending of the note and of its contents with the statement that the government could deal confidently with the subject only if supported by absolute honest manifests. He said the great embarrassment to the government in dealing with the whole matter was that some shippers had concealed contraband in the cargoes of non-contraband articles, for example, under a cargo of cotton. So long as there were instances of that kind, the President said, suspicion was cast on every shipment, and all cargoes were liable to doubt and search. So, President Wilson already knew U.S. manufacturers were illegally shipping contraband over to Europe, and hiding it in the cargoes with non-contraband items, and could only confidently deal with it supported by honest manifests. Like perhaps the Lusitania's manifest that he kept hidden away in the Treasury Department for decades? Anyways, Britain would ignore the protests from the United States, and by February 1915, the United States would again start signaling their displeasure. And then we would see on February 4th, 1915, that Germany would declare the waters around Great Britain a war zone. And on the same day in the newspapers, we would see headlines that read, Germany warns American ships to avoid France. The next day in the newspapers, we would read, the established regulations of international law provide that when a merchant ship is seized, if she cannot be taken into the home port of the captor, she may be sunk. But before striking her, the captor must take off the passengers and crew, so that their lives will not be sacrificed. And I noticed that while talking about international laws, they don't mention anything about merchant ships ramming, or the British Q-ship program that was arming all those merchant ships, and even liners, nor any mention of Britain blockading and seizing food shipments to Germany. But what they're talking about is sometimes referred to as the cruiser laws, or prize laws, and they're found in the 1909 Declaration of London Treaty, under Chapter 5, Destruction of Neutral Prizes. And they're considering merchant ships as neutrals, as they're not officially listed as combat ships. But pretty much the prize laws for neutral ships states that you cannot destroy them and must bring them to port, unless doing so would present a danger to the capturing vessel, in which case you can sink the ship. But before doing so, you must remove all personnel to safety before sinking it. Now remember, these laws were written before there was such a thing as submarine warfare. The submarine in World War I was a new weapon for which no international laws were written. Submarines were a lot smaller than the ships they would encounter, and a lot slower as well. And early in the war, Germany was indeed following the prize laws with their submarine fleet, as we'll see shortly. But the British tactics of merchant ships ramming and being armed with hidden weaponry to unleash when the sub was close enough, tactics which were in violation of the laws, combined with the blockade which was starving out the German population, Germany decided to abandon trying to stay within the framework of the prize laws and denounced the war zone with unrestricted submarine warfare. The following month would see the United States increasing its pressure on protests against the British blockade. And the British and French response to this was to tell the United States to accept it, while Germany, who the United States was also in talks with, would partially agree, until early 1917 that is. But Britain had decided to ignore international laws in a right by might campaign. And we see then Counselor to the US State Department, Robert Lansing, writing about this as well, stating the British government, by their Order in Council of October 29, 1914, put in operation during the present war the Declaration of London, with certain modifications, and directed the British courts to apply its provisions thus modified. And further, about the articles dealing with blockades, he writes, "These provisions of the Declaration are directly at variance with the procedure authorized by the Order in Council of March 15, 1915. In other words, the British are acting against the Declaration and simply making up new rules that better suit their needs." And the right by might blockade actions of Britain is how it would continue throughout the war, as we can see from this memorandum found in the British archives, written by Sir Edward Carson at the beginning of January 1917, which begins by stating, "All the evidence available tends to show that, with some minor exceptions, practically no goods coming from overseas are getting through to Germany." Now let's have a look at the behavior of the German submarines in the early stages of the war. We can see a report from November 26, 1914, where a German submarine sunk a steamer, saving the crew, and the crew was given 10 minutes to get into the ship's lifeboats. In January of 1915, a German submarine ran into another steamer, and before sinking it, they boarded the steamer and ordered the crew into the lifeboats. And remember the sub U-29 that Wikipedia thinks was the only sub that was sunk by ramming. And here we see this article is talking about the submarine captain's actions during a previous sinking, saying the submarine captain was remarkably polite, and the crew was given 10 minutes to launch their lifeboats. And while the boats were being lowered, one of the British sailors fell overboard, and the German officer, noticing his plight, sent a suit of dry clothes for him. So that's pretty neighborly. During the sinking of the British steamer Falaba, we see the German submarine captain allowed the crew and passengers 23 minutes to get to the boats and escape. And it would appear that Germans have an affection for dogs, as here we can see the Caucasian, which is the ship, who was chased for an hour and the steering gear having been destroyed was compelled to stop. Captain Robinson, who hails from Shields, gave Betty, a Pomeranian, 10 months old, to the second officer to put in the boat, but in passing the dog down to one of the crew, let the dog fall into the water. When the captain entered the boat, he saw the dog swimming towards the submarine. Without hesitation, he jumped into the water and swam about a quarter of a mile. When he reached the dog, he placed it on his shoulders, and as the submarine had by this time drawn up to him, he laid hold of the boat in order to regain his breath. And then, the commander of the submarine, in imperfect English, said to him, "I made up my mind to blow up your boats for your refusal to stop the ship, but will not do so for your brave act in saving the little dog." Consequently, 38 lives were saved owing to the rescue of the dog. The captain then swam back to his boat with the dog resting on his shoulder. So that's pretty interesting, isn't it? But not all the stories have happy endings. Well, maybe for the dogs they do. Next, we see that a year after the Lusitania was sunk, a U-boat saves the crew and then sinks the schooner, and the crew was given 15 minutes to get into the lifeboats. Later in November of 1916, and now we're deep into the war, a little past the halfway point, and we see a German submarine sinks an American ship. And notice, the crew is saved. The crew of the vessel were given time to take to the lifeboats, and the submarine towed the boats to within 5 miles of the Spanish shore. In February of 1917, The American steamer Lusitania was sunk by a German submarine. The American steamer Lusitania was given full warning by the German submarine before being sunk. An opportunity was given for the safety of the crew. The submarines took the lifeboats in tow and for an hour and a half proceeded towards the mainland. Off Penzance, the submarine fired a signal to the British patrol boats, cut loose from the tow, and submerged. On April 10, 1917, so just 4 days after the United States entered the war, we hear about two different sinkings of American merchant ships. And in both cases, the crews were told to get into the lifeboats before the ships were sunk. Now remember what I said about Germans and dogs? Well, apparently this German U-boat crew saved the pet dog and leaves the woman owner to drown. Another instance of German frightfulness came to light recently. A survivor of the torpedoed Cita de Berry declares that the wife of a well-known novelist was seen struggling in the water holding a pet dog in her arms. The submarine crew snatched the dog from her and left her to drown. Now I don't know if I buy this story or not. It sounds a bit unreal. Snatching dogs on submarine drive-bys? Like did Captain Hans order the sub to swing around and have one guy holding another by the feet so they could snatch the dog out of her hands as the sub went by? It just sounds a bit cartoonish, like it's a propaganda piece. Like maybe they could have added that old submarine Captain Hans was the woman's first husband who she divorced and took the dog, and it was his dog to begin with. That would have made for a much better story, I think. I did try to find anything that might corroborate this story, but came up empty. So I don't know. It could be true, or it could be propaganda. I could believe either. Anyways, as late into the war as August of 1918, we see the Canadian schooner Bianca was captured and sunk by a German submarine, and the crew was saved. And remember the 3 ships that were sunk by the U-20 in the 2 days leading up to the U-20 sinking the Lusitania? Well, the crews of all 3 ships were allowed to get into the lifeboats and were saved. So when the U-20 encountered the Lusitania, what do you think the U-20's captain, Walter Schwager's actual intentions were? He only fired 1 torpedo. The second larger explosion came from something within the ship. So after everything we've looked at, do you really think Captain Schwager had the intentions of the wholesale and willful, deliberate and premeditated murder of the people on board the Lusitania? Or is it more likely that he only intended to cripple the ship, expecting her to remain afloat for hours, and most certainly long enough for her passengers safely to take to the lifeboats? Instead of getting the truth about what really happened to the Lusitania, the world was subject to a massive propaganda campaign painting Germany as barbaric, murderous Huns, not fit for the civilized world. And while we're speaking of intentions, what do you suppose were the true intentions of Winston Churchill, Room 40, and a select few of Churchill's inner circle? Despite what the conspiracies might say, I don't actually believe Churchill was hoping the Lusitania was going to be sunk with that many people being killed. He did know the Lusitania was sailing into waters where the German sub U-20 was lurking around. And what I think happened was Churchill was using the same tactics used by Q ships like the Farnborough, where they would lure enemy submarines in close, and then unleash its hidden weaponry and fire a barrage, sinking the sub. I think the Lusitania probably was armed, and they were hoping a sub would go after her, and the Lusitania would fight back and sink the sub, and they could use that in the newsreels, and the Lusitania would be the toast of the world. And even if not armed, the Lusitania was by far the fastest ship on the seas at the time, so a sub behind it or to its sides should be easy to outrun and escape, while a sub in front would be easy pickings for ramming. And if the Lusitania could sink a German U-boat, that would be major publicity for the propaganda machine. But in a worst-case scenario, if the Lusitania was sunk, they probably thought that, like the Titanic, it would take hours for the Lusitania to go down. And she did have enough lifeboats for everyone, so the loss of life should be minimal, if any. And perhaps an atrocity such as sinking a passenger liner is what would bring the United States into the war on the Allies' side, which of course would be the benefit in that scenario, which we know ultimately didn't happen for 2 more years. So, just let the Lusitania sail into waters with no escort, where a U-boat is known to be sitting in wait, and see what happens. But 2 unexpected things did happen that they didn't count on. The first being that no one on the Lusitania was aware of the U-20's presence until it fired the torpedo. A couple of people saw a periscope and the torpedo followed immediately, so there was no time for the Lusitania to react, whether to get the guns out if she was indeed armed, or line up a collision course to ram. The second unexpected thing to happen was the second explosion ripped open enough of the ship to cause her to rapidly sink in only 18 minutes. And I'm quite sure Churchill and select others at the Admiralty certainly didn't expect that to happen, nor did they expect 1,200 people would be killed as a result. So now let's take a deeper look into the second explosion, and I'll show you what I believe to be the cause of it, as well as the cause of it being covered up ever since. Now remember Dudley F. Malone, the collector of customs for the Port of New York, who said he walked the decks of the Lusitania an hour before she departed and saw no guns, and also sent a statement to the British Inquiry, as per President Wilson and Secretary of State Lansing, telling the British Inquiry that everything on board was legal to be shipped on passenger liners, and also repeated the ship had no explosives on board? Well, in 1920, he ran for governor of New York on the Farmer Labor Party ticket, and made some rather astonishing admissions. About President Wilson's administration, he said, "When the record of the Wilson administration becomes a matter of open history," Mr. Malone declared, "the world will realize that no government ever perpetuated such a reign of oppression and secrecy upon a people." And he would further go on to say, "President Wilson was perfectly right when he denied the charge made by the German government that the Lusitania was armed. She was not armed, but the administration was dead wrong when it sought to keep from the public all the facts about the Lusitania case." So he still believes that the Lusitania wasn't armed, and that belief comes from the fact that he walked around the ship for an hour before she departed and didn't see any guns. And don't forget the other inspectors who were also in charge of the cargo didn't see any guns. But considering what was in the cargo, I don't take their word for much anyways. And the bottom line is that we'll never know if the Lusitania had hidden guns on board or not. But I do find Dudley Malone's admissions that the Wilson administration hid all the facts about the Lusitania from the public to be rather interesting. And what I find astonishing is what else he admitted. Dudley Field Malone, former collector of the Port of New York and candidate for governor of New York on the Farmer Labor ticket, in an address declared that when the Lusitania was sunk by a German submarine, she carried a consignment of 4,200 cases of cartridges for the British government, which contained nearly 11 tons of black powder. Mr. Malone said, "It has been admitted by the German Admiralty that the Lusitania was struck by a German torpedo, but it will never be known whether or not there was a second explosion in the Lusitania's cargo, which made her sink before she could be beached. We do not know, and never will know actually, what was in all the boxes and cases which made up this cargo. But we did know that there was one consignment on board the Lusitania of 4,200 cases of Springfield metallic cartridges, each case containing 1,000 cartridges with 5 pounds of black powder to each 1,000 cartridges. Therefore, there was concentrated in one consignment in the hold of the vessel a shipment of nearly 11 tons of black powder, which by the impact of the torpedo may very well have contributed to the incredibly rapid sinking of the great liner. The other consignments of ammunition and shrapnel known to have been on the Lusitania were consigned to the British government, but contained no explosives." So 11 tons of black powder? I didn't see that on the manifest. And pretty interesting, he admits that they don't really know what the cargo actually was. And notice the bottom part where he says, the other consignments of ammunition and shrapnel known to have been on the Lusitania were consigned to the British government, but contained no explosives. Except for these.
Artillery fuses, and we now know that when they were coming up from the bottom, they were in fact live.
So the Lusitania had thousands of live fuses, 11 tons of black powder, millions of rounds of .303s, and thousands of artillery shrapnel shells. And I see no reason to believe Judge Mayer's assertion that they were consisting merely of empty shells without any powder charge. I think they weren't quite so empty, and did indeed have a powder charge and were probably part of the overall second explosion, along with the 11 tons of black powder and other cargo. But here's the thing, even if this was the case, it's been over 100 years now. Surely the public can handle it if the truth was simply that the second explosion was caused by the known munitions that were stored in the cargo hold. The New York Times finally told the truth about there being only one torpedo, and the public handled it. So what is it about the Lusitania's sinking that still has to be covered up to this day? In 2011, Greg Bemis and Owen McGarry would dive the Lusitania once again, this time with National Geographic on board to document the dive. And in 2012, National Geographic would release a documentary about it.
Yeah, well, not know your insight, no.
Yeah.
The investigation has finally gotten a break, a big break. To everyone's surprise, the video ray doesn't just get inside the wreck. It is somehow able to maneuver down through 2 collapsed deck levels, all the way to the interior cargo area.
It's very hard to differentiate between straight destruction from a blast of one kind or another versus 95 years of collapse. Whenever I see these stringers at an acute angle from the rest of it, it implies that it was part of an explosive reaction rather than just falling in. Here you've got girders crossing each other, different directions, that one, this one, this one. How do you get turmoil like that without some massive internal explosion?
We're seeing some pretty interesting stuff in there. We are seeing some hull plates, some beams, which are in orientations now which can't really be explained from the way she settled naturally.
With the field expedition over, the Lusitania investigation shifted to Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory in Northern California. A secure facility funded by the Department of Energy, it was established in 1952 to spur innovation and competition in nuclear weapons design. The science of explosives is quite simply their business.
And there they would run simulations on 4 different scenarios of explosions to determine which might have been strong enough to rip through the Lusitania's double steel hull plating. And of the 4 simulations they did, gun cotton was the only one strong enough to be able to blast through the ship's steel plating. Gun cotton is kind of like a more refined version of black powder, and there were plenty of rumors of it being aboard the Lusitania as well. But aluminum powder, which was also on the Lusitania's manifest, coal dust, and the ship's boilers, while having very loud and spectacular looking explosive qualities, just don't have the strength to rip through the Lusitania's hull, whereas a propellant like gun cotton does. But incredibly, the scientists at the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory ruled out the possibility of a gun cotton explosion because it didn't explode immediately with the impact of the torpedo.
The problem lies with the time delay. 15 to 30 seconds elapsed between the torpedo strike and the second blast. But the test showed that a gun cotton explosion would have been almost instantaneous to the torpedo detonating.
So, you know, the energy's there, the power is there. Can you really make that go off? It's very speculative. It's something that seems highly unlikely.
Highly unlikely? I think his explanation is highly unlikely, and you'll see why I say that in a minute. But to note, not all were in agreement with that.
I think the gun cotton was the most likely scenario. You know, this was kind of the suspicious character in the room when we came in, and I don't see anything that takes the suspicion away from this character.
The cargo hold with the munitions were 150 feet away from where the torpedo struck. So why would they think gun cotton, or any other explosive, would have to explode immediately upon the impact of the torpedo? Knowing the munitions were 150 feet, or 50 yards, away from the torpedo hit, it makes perfect sense that it would take another 15 to 30 seconds for the fires to reach that area. They say the most likely cause of the second explosion was a boiler, and there was no further damage to the hull, meaning the Lusitania sank in only 18 minutes solely due to the impact hole from the torpedo strike, and of course any open portholes, which is ridiculous in my opinion. Now that being said, I do believe that it might be very possible that a boiler did go up, and perhaps that may have triggered the nearby munitions, with everything going off in rapid succession. Remember how survivor Joseph Mauricio described the second blast, saying, "The nature of the explosion was similar to the rattling of a machine gun for a short period." He was at the back of the ship in the second-class dining room when he felt the rattling underneath the dining room floor, and his description sounds very much like the munitions went off in quick succession. But even with that, there's a couple of boxes that don't check off. One being the descriptions from survivors and rescuers about the immediate scene and effects the second explosion had on the people on board. They don't match up with the second blast only being a boiler, or regular munitions, which we'll see shortly. And the second is that again, why the 100-year-long cover-up? It certainly can't be because some regular munitions exploded, or perhaps the ship was secretly armed, or to keep covering up the two torpedo line. Those are things that after 100 years, the world would be able to absorb and not be too shocked. But for those same 100+ years and counting, the official line is that there were no explosives on board the ship, and governments have interfered with and obstructed every attempt at dives and salvage operations to this day. And don't forget what appears to be attempts to blow up the ship at various times over the decades as well. So was there something else on the ship and the cargo they don't want the world to know about? I believe that to be the case. And it checks all the boxes too, including the need to keep the cover-up going to this day. In modern times, there's little mention of this part of the Lusitania's story, but if you dig around enough, you will find some references to it. They write here a few days after the sinking of the Lusitania, and it was actually 2 days after, as we'll see. John Braun, a chemist and former teacher, made a startling revelation. He alleged the ship was carrying 250 barrels of anhydrous tetrachloride, a chemical weapon headed for France, according to The Tragedy of the Lusitania, which was a book published in 1915. But there it is, the big elephant in the room that nobody wants to talk about. Chemical weapons. More commonly known today as WMDs, weapons of mass destruction. And again they're citing the book, The Tragedy of the Lusitania, written by Frederick B. Ellis in 1915, and we'll have a look at that coming up. And notice down below they say there was no investigation of John Braun's claims. In 2011, from the book Willful Murder, The Sinking of the Lusitania, it talks about a report in the New York Times suggesting the Lusitania had been carrying 250,000 pounds of tetrachloride for the French government for use in fabricating gas bombs. In the 2002 book, Lusitania, An Epic Tragedy, we see the same thing, a report in the New York Times suggesting that the Lusitania had been carrying 250,000 pounds of tetrachloride for the French government for use in fabricating gas bombs. From the 1996 book, The Last Voyage of the Lusitania, it states a Pittsburgh chemist claimed that 250,000 pounds of tetrachloride from his laboratory were aboard the Lusitania, and it was intended for use in poison gas bombs, and that nobody took him very seriously. So when you search through more modern media, we see the claims about Dr. John Braun a little bit here and there, but there's not very much information about it. And the claims seem to be originally sourced from either the 1915 book, The Tragedy of the Lusitania, or a report in the New York Times. So let's go back to 1915 and have a look at what we can find. And we'll start with Frederick B. Ellis's book, The Tragedy of the Lusitania. And he writes that the Lusitania would never reach her destination was a prediction made by Dr. John Braun, and it's Braun with an N, not an M. But he goes on to say that Dr. Braun, of the University of Berlin, who formerly taught chemistry and other subjects in the De Quesnay University, and who later was in charge of a laboratory in a local manufacturing concern. Dr. Braun's connection with this company gave to him the information on which was based his prediction. The company manufactured tetrachloride of tin, which has come into use in the European War in the making of asphyxiating bombs. Dr. Braun learned of a big shipment of this material for the French government being sent aboard the Lusitania. And that's all Frederick B. Ellis would write about Dr. Braun in The Tragedy of the Lusitania. So we learn a little bit more about Dr. Braun perhaps, but not too much really. And while I was on the hunt for the New York Times article about him, I came across this from the Evening Star out of Washington on June 26, 1915. A statement out of Germany that says the Allies used gas before the Germans. The first point made is that the British and French employed such gases before the Germans, which is something we see in outlets from modern times. But you'll notice that all of them say that France used tear gas, which is non-lethal or not deadly, while saying that Germany was the first to use poison gas at the Second Battle of Ypres in April 1915. Now, taking a look back to almost the beginning of the war, we see on August 26, 1914, use of deadly gas bomb is threatened by French, and they talk about a gas bomb which kills every living thing within 300 yards. 1 month later, on September 26, 1914, we see the French artillery are using a new shell which contains a mysterious poisonous turpentine gas which is deadly poison, causing paralysis. Death is almost instantaneous. Entire lines of German dead have been found in the trenches standing as if about to shoot, but have died from the sudden effect of the gas, which has exploded over the trenches by the guns. So I don't know about you, but that doesn't sound like tear gas to me. But at any rate, the accepted version today is that the French only used tear gas, while it was the Germans who first used poison gas. Anyways, going back to the Evening Star article, we see below, the German statement refers to alleged reports published in American newspapers that the Lusitania carried 250,000 pounds of tetrachloride of tin consigned to the French government and intended for the production of asphyxiating gases. So the Germans are talking about reports in American newspapers, and we know one of those newspapers is the New York Times. And it took a little bit of time to find that New York Times article, but find it, I did. And it was put out on May 11th, 1915, so 4 days after the sinking of the Lusitania. And after talking about some of the ammunition and cargo, we see, moreover, according to a statement of Dr. John Braun, a chemist of Pittsburgh, she had in her holds 250,000 pounds of tetrachloride, the chemical used for generating asphyxiating gases. And that's all the New York Times would say about Dr. John Braun's claims, which I found to be rather disappointing, because after digging around to find it, it told me less than I already knew. And I'm sure, as you must be able to tell by now, I want to know more. So of course I kept digging away, and from the Pittsburgh Press on Sunday morning, May 9th, 1915, so only 2 days after the sinking of the Lusitania, I finally found the full story on Dr. Braun and the 250,000 pounds of tetrachloride. Quote, material made in the Pittsburgh district figured in the destruction of the Lusitania. There was no conspiracy here for that purpose, as has been hinted. But the shipment of certain deadly war materials to the French army from a Pittsburgh district plant made the blowing up of the vessel almost a foregone conclusion, and I predicted what occurred 4 days before the event. End quote. The above is part of a statement made last night by Dr. John Braun, the chemist, graduate of the University of Berlin, where he earned the degree of Doctor of Philosophy, who has been in the United States for 30 years and in the Pittsburgh district about 7 years. During the first few years of the latter period, he taught chemistry, physics, geology, mathematics, and other subjects at the old Holy Coast College, now DeQuesne University. Later, he was in charge of the laboratory of a local manufacturing company. It was the latter work that gave him the information on which was based the prediction of the blowing up of the Lusitania. In the plant of this company was manufactured a chemical substance used in industry, which has come into use in the European war in the making of asphyxiating bombs. He learned of a big shipment of this material for the French government being sent aboard the Lusitania, and that, with other information, caused him to make the positive prediction that the ship would never be allowed to reach port. Dr. Braun's statement follows, and this is written by Dr. John Braun himself. From information in my possession, I made the prediction last Monday that the Lusitania would never reach her intended destination. Rumors have been circulated that a plot was hatched in Pittsburgh to blow up the steamer from inside. These rumors are groundless and nothing but the fiction of an idle fantasy. Besides other war materials, the Lusitania carried 250 barrels of 1,000 pounds each of anhydrous tetrachloride of tin, manufactured by a company in the Pittsburgh district and destined for the French government. Tetrachloride of tin is a volatile substance having a very pungent and suffocating odor. The shipment contained in the hold of the Lusitania was intended to be used in making asphyxiating bombs to be thrown into the German ranks by the French forces. The shipment was made from Pittsburgh. Evidently, the German authorities knew it was in the hold of the ship, and it was to their interest to prevent this cargo reaching its destination. To anyone who knew all these circumstances, it was an easy matter to predict what would happen, taking into account the time of departure and the usual time for the Lusitania to cross the Atlantic, in connection with the reports as to where the German submarines had shown great activity lately. Thus it happened that last Monday I arrived at the conclusion that by Thursday or Friday of this week, the big steamer would be in the neighborhood of the Scillies, and there meet the German submarine. The place where the torpedoing occurred is less than 50 miles from these islands. On account of this, I made the prediction to some of my German friends in a public place where it was overheard by outsiders. Only a few miles and a few hours difference occurred in the actual torpedoing of the boat. Illuminating as to what actually occurred when the doomed steamer was struck is this excerpt from the latest newspaper accounts of the disaster. Quote, "Fumes from the explosive permeated every section of the smashed steamer. Many of the passengers fell to the deck unconscious. Others staggered out to the boats and were helped on board." End quote. The fumes mentioned did not come from the torpedoes, but came from the barrels of tetrachloride of tin, which were smashed by the exploding torpedoes. These fumes have the effect on those not accustomed to them of causing violent coughing, impaired breathing, and thereby causing collapse into unconsciousness. This condition usually lasts only a short time if the person can escape from the issuing fumes. In this case, escape from the fumes was of course very difficult. Though the inrushing water must have allayed a great amount of the fumes, the water taking up the tetrachloride, becoming exceedingly hot through the action of the chemical, must have added greatly to the suffering of the doomed people struggling in the water. It is a characteristic of the fumes of tetrachloride that they cause the persons affected to stagger about before being entirely overcome. So, now that we have a bigger and clearer picture of Dr. John Braun's claims, and I see no reason for him to lie. Some might say, well, he was born in Germany, but don't forget, he lived and taught and worked in the United States for the previous 30 years to this point. And what he says indeed fills some of the remaining blanks in the Lusitania's story, such as the need for the century-long cover-up of it all. Let's have a look at some of the descriptions of the victims in the immediate aftermath of the torpedo hitting and the second explosion. And we can see on May 8th, the day after the sinking, fumes filled the liner causing suffocation, and scores overcome were carried to the lifeboats or were left lifeless on the decks. Poison fumes from torpedoes. When the torpedoes burst, they sent forth suffocating fumes which had their effect on the passengers, causing some of them to lose consciousness. And of course there were no poison fumes coming from the torpedoes. Here's the article that Dr. Braun had cited. Fumes from the explosive permeated every section of the smashed steamer. Many of the passengers fell to the deck unconscious. Others staggered to the boats and were helped on board. About the explosion, exploded with such force that the interior was wrecked, and the entire vessel below decks filled with sickening fumes. The wounded and the dead indicate that there was enormous havoc in the interior of the vessel. It cannot be conceived that passengers could be hurt in this way. The tragic freight of bodies taken to Queenstown bears evidence of the havoc wrought. More than a score died after they were removed to Cork and Queenstown hospitals, and a score is 20 for those who don't know. And remember survivor Oliver P. Bernard and his descriptions. A terrific explosion inside blew right up through the 4 decks. It reminded me on a large scale of the pictures showing mine explosions in the trenches at the front. Hundreds of people must have been blown to atoms, including stokers and trimmers, to say nothing of the men and women in the forward cabins who were about to come on deck. And remember what Churchill would later write in 1923. 2 torpedoes were fired, the second a few minutes later striking her aft. And 2 weeks after the sinking, on May 20th, we would see more than 500 passengers and sailors on the Lusitania are believed to have been killed or injured so badly they were rendered helpless by the explosion. So, the second explosion was massive, no doubt, and with good reason. And the reports and descriptions from survivors make Dr. John Braun's claims very much more credible in my opinion, which also explains the need to keep it all covered up for the last century. At any rate, what I believe happened was that shortly after the torpedo hit the ship, a boiler, or maybe multiple boilers, also exploded, triggering the munitions to simultaneously go off, which matches the description we see in Joseph Maurichel's testimony that no authorities wanted to hear or accept. Instead, the authorities were not only just covering up their part in the disaster, but also deflecting the entirety of the blame and responsibility of it solely onto Germany. The British had to cover up their actions, including the carrying of war munitions on a passenger liner, not to mention knowing the U-20 was in the waters the Lusitania was about to sail through. And they didn't tell the Lusitania that 3 ships had been sunk in the 2 days previous in those same waters, nor did they send an escort despite knowing what most likely lay in wait for the Lusitania. Meanwhile, on the US side, the Wilson administration and the courts had to cover up the truth about passenger liners like the Lusitania carrying war munitions, which was against US laws at the time. And if Dr. Braun's statements are true, then that's something both sides would most definitely want to keep secret and covered up to this day. And I personally believe Dr. Braun's claims. Like I say, it answers a lot of questions left blank for over 100 years. I also believe the bulk of the so-called empty shells went off. The fuses had powder and were live, so why wouldn't the shells be the same? And they would also have more than enough power to blow through the hull and the decks, as survivor Oliver Bernard described. And something else I've noticed after going through the decades of various stories and articles and documents and so on, is that there's no mention of the shells anywhere except from the original transcripts of the time. So even though there's been many dives there, and there's still millions of rounds of Remington's 303s at the site, and they found at least one case of the unexploded fuses, no one's mentioned a thing about seeing any unexploded shells or shell casings or anything like that. They admitted to the ammunition, fuses, and shells back in 1915 at the British Inquiry, and the ammunition and some of the fuses have been found, but not one shell. Not even the mention of a shell, as far as I could find. And I believe that's because they exploded, causing the catastrophic damage that would sink the Lusitania in only 18 minutes. And the barrels of tetrachloride exploding would explain the people dying on the decks and even later in the hospitals from the so-called poison fumes of the torpedo. And of course there were no poison fumes coming from the torpedo. That was from something else. And I'm quite sure the 11 tons of black powder went up as well. But chemical weapons on board or not, I believe it's most certainly a fact that the second explosion involved whatever munitions were on board. And literally hundreds were killed instantly just in the explosion alone. And a lot of that blood is on the hands of the people who orchestrated that cargo, as well as the ones who covered it all up. And speaking of shells, in Pittsburgh, check this out. It was reported in Pittsburgh yesterday, so that would be May the 8th, the day after the sinking, that $65,000 worth of shells manufactured by the Westinghouse Company were in the hold of the Lusitania when the ship was torpedoed. E.M. Herr, president of the Westinghouse Company, stated last night that if any shells made by his company were aboard the Lusitania, he knew nothing of it. He said, quote, "Our company has manufactured no shrapnel shells. We have made ordinary shells, however, but have no means of knowing where they are destined for, or in what manner they arrive, as we sell them to an ordnance company in Washington and deliver them on cars." So that's pretty interesting. Like the reports about barrels of anhydrous tetrachloride coming from Pittsburgh, ordinary shells may have also come out of Pittsburgh and been in the Lusitania's cargo. And there's Westinghouse's president, Edwin M. Herr, right away saying, no, we don't know where they go. I don't know anything about it. And of course, he most certainly wouldn't want to be associated with anything to do with the Lusitania at this point, to be sure. And remember, Dudley Malone, the collector of customs of the Port of New York, would later admit they never really knew it was in the cargo at all. So who knows? But like the tetrachloride story, also out of Pittsburgh, Reports of shells from Westinghouse on the Lusitania seem to have stopped dead in their tracks right after the initial reporting of it. Here's a few more names you never hear in association with the Lusitania. And while we do know the bullets are 303s from Remington, and it was Marcellus Hartley who owned Remington at the time, he was already 8 years into his marriage to William Rockefeller's daughter, Geraldine Rockefeller, who brought over $100 million into the marriage with her. And William himself would become part owner a year later. And don't forget Samuel Pryor, who, while also working for Percy Rockefeller, William Rockefeller's son and Geraldine's brother, Pryor was also general manager of Remington starting in 1913. So the Rockefellers do indeed have a connection to the Lusitania. And we also see on June 4th, 1915, the Collector of Customs of the Port of New York, Dudley Malone, wrote to the Secretary of the Treasury, William McAdoo. And this wasn't made public until 1939, but we can see that a lot of the powder from the 4,200 cases of Remington 303s were filled with powder from the DuPont de Nemours Powder Company. So how about that? The DuPonts have a connection to the Lusitania. And just to throw it out there, considering they were the biggest chemical manufacturer in the United States, and maybe still are today, but perhaps they also played a role in the barrels of tetrachloride? Again, who knows, but it wouldn't surprise me. And naturally, another of the Wall Street kings would also have a connection to the Lusitania, J.P. Morgan Jr. Remember, it was in January of 1915, so 4 months before the sinking, J.P. Morgan became the sole purchasing agent for the British government. So almost all the cargo on the Lusitania, especially any war munitions and raw materials, were done on contracts that were run through J.P. Morgan and Company,